In terms of raw profit, the British Crown's illicit drug operation yielded greater annual revenue than Microsoft generates from its Windows operating system today. By 1839, Great Britain had established history's largest narcotics syndicate, an enterprise valued at an astonishing $284 billion in contemporary currency. This massive criminal network did not operate in the dark recesses of society or rely on clandestine organizations. Instead, it was conducted brazenly, utilizing the power of Royal Navy warships, sanctioned government officials, and the unwavering endorsement of the British Parliament. But that colossal $284 billion fortune didn't disappear into thin air. It became the very foundation of British power. Look at the sovereign's scepter, one of the most sacred symbols of the British Crown, set with the Cullinan I diamond, also known as the first star of Africa, the largest cut colorless diamond in the world. This entire symbol of power, this wealth, was fundamentally secured by a commercial system so ruthless that it relied on poisoning $1 million in Asia and enslaving $1 million in the Caribbean. This documentary is not just about history. It's about exposing how that wealth, from the diamond on the scepter to the gold in the Bank of England, was sourced, and the terrifying legacy it left behind. Their ultimate target was the Qing dynasty, then the most powerful empire on the globe, China. The true horror, however, is not simply the mass addiction of the Chinese populace. This campaign served as the foundational blueprint for modern economic warfare. The globe's initial systematic effort to cripple a competing economy through the calculated deployment of controlled substances. The British sought far more than China's precious silver and renowned silk. They aimed to shatter China's 4 millennia legacy as the preeminent global civilization. What makes this history so morally jarring is the sheer hypocrisy. The British Crown, the very institution championing Christian morality throughout its vast empire, transformed itself into history's most extensive drug cartel. They cultivated the opium in British, controlled India, funneled it into China via tightly supervised British networks. And when the sovereign Chinese government attempted to halt the trade, Britain responded by initiating war twice. This was a state-sponsored enterprise so massively profitable that its proceeds financed the explosive expansion of the Industrial Revolution, subsidized the construction of the modern British Navy, and cemented London's status as the world's unchallenged financial hub. The East India Company, EIC, which functioned as Britain's corporate shield for this endeavor, amassed greater yearly profits from opium sales alone than the entire gross domestic product of numerous contemporary European states. The Chinese desperately labeled the narcotic the foreign mud that destroys souls. British traders, conversely, marketed it as God's own medicine, and politicians in London sanctimoniously referred to the entire process as free trade. Yet, the quantitative data reveals the brutal truth. Between 1,820 and 1,840, British opium flooded the market, creating roughly $12 million Chinese addicts. That meant approximately 4% of China's total population was systemically hooked on a drug entirely cultivated, refined, and distributed by Britain. This narrative documents how a relatively small island nation positioned off the European mainland utilized institutionalized drug trafficking to destabilize the world's most ancient continuous civilization. It details the transformation of mass addiction into formal imperial policy, and explains how the wealth generated by poisoning $1 million established the fundamental structures of the contemporary global economy. The subsequent events irrevocably reshaped the global hierarchy, establishing a template for economic imperialism that remains in use even now, proving that the most ruthless criminals often operate while wearing crowns rather than masks. But how did this small, peripheral island nation first accumulate the initial wealth and naval power necessary to even launch an enterprise as colossal as the East India Company? To answer that, we must trace the Crown's history back to its terrifying, piratical origins. But to truly appreciate how the British Crown financed this immense operation, we must first look at its seed capital. The British Empire wasn't built on fair trade or hard work alone. It was built on state-sponsored piracy on a global scale. In the late 1500s, England was a second-rate power, poor and underdeveloped, humiliated by Spain's dominance. Queen Elizabeth I responded by issuing letters of marque legal licenses that turned pirates into privateers to attack Spanish ships. The most famous of these state-backed pirates was Sir Francis Drake, whose voyage around the world was basically one long, carefully planned robbery spree. His plunder was so massive that the haul from a single galleon, the Cacafuego, was worth over $40 million in today's money. Critically, Queen Elizabeth, who had secretly financed the voyage, received a share big enough to pay off her national debt. This financial system of theft became the seed capital of the empire. The violence was dressed up in the language of law and commerce. This established the cynical principle that would define the empire, extracting wealth from others, funneling it back home, and calling it progress. By 1840, Britain achieved an act unparalleled in global history. They successfully converted an entire sovereign nation, China, home to 1/3 of humanity, into a captive customer base for illegal drugs. But to truly appreciate the audacity of this operation, we must understand the kingdom that birthed it. In the 16th century, England was a small island nation with limited global influence, poor, underdeveloped, and humiliated by the dominance of larger Catholic powers like Spain and Portugal. Queen Elizabeth I, facing enormous debt, turned to a different weapon: state-sponsored piracy, issuing letters of marque to turn pirates into privateers. These were not random criminals. They were looters in the service of the state, attacking Spanish ships loaded with silver and gold. Figures like Sir Francis Drake were celebrated not just as heroic explorers, but as men who undertook voyages that were essentially carefully planned robbery sprees. Drake's plunder was so massive that the haul from a single galleon, the Cacafuego, was estimated to be worth over $40 million in today's money. Queen Elizabeth, who secretly financed the trip, used her share to pay off the nation's entire national debt. This financial system of theft became the seed capital of the empire, strengthening the navy and funneling capital into the English economy, laying the groundwork for greater enterprises like the East India Company. Thus, the British Empire was built on extraction, legitimized by the state, and funded by people who rarely bore the risk themselves, a principle that would define its expansion for centuries. But to fully comprehend how a nominally Christian empire evolved into the world's foremost drug trafficker, we must revert to 1757, the moment Britain first diagnosed its China problem. Imagine yourself as a British trader in the 1752, eager for Chinese silk, fine porcelain, and, crucially, tea. These commodities were essential luxuries throughout Europe. However, there was a fundamental obstacle. The Chinese simply had no interest in British goods. The Qing Empire was functionally self-sufficient, boasting superior manufacturing processes, highly efficient agriculture, and technological development that frequently outpaced the West. When European ships arrived bearing items like British woolens, raw metals, or finished manufactured goods, Chinese mandarins offered a polite but firm rejection. "We possess everything we require," they would state. "Payment must be rendered in silver." This arrangement resulted in what economists dryly refer to as a severe trade imbalance, a phrase that scarcely captures the depth of Britain's financial crisis. Annually, colossal quantities of silver streamed directly from British vaults into Chinese treasuries. British merchants were essentially hemorrhaging specie, simply to maintain access to desirable Chinese products, with zero viable commodities to offer in exchange. The Chinese were not acting arbitrarily. Their stance was purely logical. Why exchange superior products for visibly inferior foreign alternatives? In 1750, China operated as the indisputable workshop of the world, capable of producing goods of higher quality and lower cost than any other nation. They had perfected sophisticated steel production a millennium before Europe achieved similar methods. They were the originators of gunpowder, printing technology, paper currency, and the magnetic compass. From the Qing perspective, Europeans were mere barbarians with nothing genuinely valuable to contribute. Britain exhaustively attempted every avenue. They presented British manufactured wares, only to be met with derision from skilled Chinese artisans. They offered European fine art and advanced scientific tools, finding that the Chinese already owned superior indigenous versions. They even attempted to export British culture and Christianity. The Chinese emperor, responding to an earlier diplomatic mission, famously articulated the position, "China possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its borders." Simultaneously, the British economy was undergoing a massive transformation. The Industrial Revolution was gaining momentum. Textile mills were running constantly, and the British Empire was relentlessly expanding worldwide. Paradoxically, this entire growth cycle relied heavily on Chinese imports. British high society demanded Chinese silk. British elites considered Chinese tea an absolute necessity. British factories relied on specific Chinese raw materials. Every single transaction siphoned vital silver directly from the British treasury into impregnable Chinese vaults. The East India Company, EIC, which served as Britain's primary corporate instrument in Asia, was hemorrhaging cash. Although the EIC controlled enormous territories in India, maintained private armies, and possessed the authority to levy taxes like a sovereign government, its dealings with China were an utter financial catastrophe. The EIC functioned effectively as an advanced cash machine, perpetually dispensing silver to the Qing Empire. By 1770, company officials were frantic. They urgently needed a commodity, any commodity that the Chinese populace would purchase. Their goal was simple: to invert the financial dynamics and position Britain as the indispensable supplier rather than the dependent customer. Their solution was found unexpectedly in the hilly regions of Bengal, India. For centuries, local cultivators had grown poppy flowers, harvesting small amounts of opium for limited traditional medical uses. It was small, scale, and insignificant. However, British agricultural specialists instantly recognized a potential the local farmers had missed. These specific Bengal poppies could be cultivated to yield opium significantly more potent and highly addictive than any strain available elsewhere. Crucially, they discovered that a small segment of the Chinese population, primarily poor laborers and low-ranking soldiers, were already consuming minor quantities of opium recreationally. While this practice was not widespread and had, in fact, been officially banned by the Chinese government decades earlier due to recognition of its destructive power, a latent market existed. British officials seized this opportunity, recognizing the potential not merely to sell an existing product, but to aggressively cultivate mass demand where none had previously been sustained. They formulated a plan for total vertical integration: cultivate the opium in British, administered India, refine it using strictly supervised British techniques, transport it on British ships, and distribute it through wholly British networks. For the first time, they would command the entire supply chain of a commodity that the Chinese could be made to crave. The moral hazards were immediately apparent. Opium was a dangerous, highly addictive substance, explicitly prohibited by Chinese national law. Selling it required defying a sovereign power, inflicting mass addiction upon its citizenry, and actively destabilizing its social structure. British officials were fully aware of these consequences, Their own medical professionals had issued dire warnings regarding opium's physiological effects. However, the potential financial windfall proved too tempting to resist. The new system promised to reverse the centuries-old dynamic. Silver would flow robustly from China back toward Britain. Britain would transform from China's subservient customer to its commanding supplier. Instead of supplicating Chinese merchants for modest trade concessions, British traders would now dictate ruthless terms to million-dollar-s of desperate Chinese addicts. The East India Company made a calculated decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of world history. They initiated the transformation of their Indian holdings into the planet's largest dedicated narcotics manufacturing zone. To correct Britain's persistent trade deficit, they would engineer a mass addiction epidemic within China, employing the Royal Navy to safeguard their illicit shipments and securing the British government's official endorsement to legitimize their drug profits. This strategy transcended mere commercial gain. It was a pure exercise of imperial power. For 4 millennia, China had stood as the global civilization leader, having weathered devastating invasions, natural calamities, and violent internal upheaval, while retaining its status as humanity's most advanced society. But Britain was prepared to demonstrate that no empire, regardless of its age or strength, could withstand the systematic poisoning and mass addiction of its own people. The ensuing operation generated the most lucrative criminal enterprise in history, permanently establishing the template for modern economic warfare and proving a terrifying truth: that sometimes the most potent weapon is not military might, but a substance that compels a population towards self-destruction. But perhaps the most chilling truth is that this wasn't just a historical event, it was the invention of a business model. The detailed strategy used by the East India Company, controlling the supply chain, minimizing reported addiction risks, leveraging sophisticated distribution networks, and deflecting accountability became the foundational blueprint for the global economic system. Even today, when we look at the devastating modern opioid crisis, the pharmaceutical companies behind it, like Purdue Pharma, used business models nearly identical to those pioneered by the British opium merchants 2 centuries ago. They learned how to make conquest profoundly profitable for them and systematically poisonous for the population. This is the story of how the most successful empire in history proved that the most potent weapon is not military might, but a product that compels a population towards self-destruction. The East India Company, EIC, was not initially destined to become the world's largest narcotics syndicate. When British merchants were granted their royal charter by Queen Elizabeth I in 1600, their objectives were entirely legitimate: importing valuable spices, establishing secure trading posts, and competing directly with powerful Dutch merchants across Asian markets. Yet, by 1757, a profound shift had occurred. The company had ceased being a mere trading entity. It had become an autonomous ruling power. The EIC was unlike any other corporation in history. It operated as an empire within an empire, simultaneously entwined with Britain's imperial history while also colonizing vast swathes of Asia as its own private entity. It was a dangerously unregulated private company that possessed a private army 3 times the size of the British government's armed forces. Unlike previous conquerors, the East India Company's sole purpose was to enrich its shareholders by siphoning the wealth of India and transferring it westward. This rapacious hunger led to catastrophic consequences for India, including the Bengal famine of 1770, which claimed over $10 million lives, an apocalyptic disaster that occurred under company rule. The EIC, therefore, quickly transformed from a commercial entity to a political and military force, choosing sovereign taxation and extraction over simple trade. This dramatic transformation unfolded gradually, then suddenly. British merchants initially arrived in India as supplicants, offering gifts, following indigenous customs, and humbly seeking permission from local rulers to set up minor trading posts. For decades, they existed merely as another cohort of foreign traders attempting to secure profit in Asia's lucrative markets. The pivotal event that reset everything was the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Robert Clive, originally a company clerk who had successfully transitioned into a ruthless military commander, routed the Nawab of Bengal using a combination of superior military tactics and extensive strategic bribery. Almost overnight, the East India Company gained command of Bengal, India's wealthiest province, and home to a population larger than Britain's own. Clive himself left a stunning description of the immediate aftermath. A great prince was dependent on my pleasure. An opulent city lay at my mercy. Its richest bankers bid against each other for my smiles. The company had unearthed a source of profit vastly superior to trade itself, sovereign taxation and extraction. Why bother negotiating complex deals with indigenous rulers when one could simply seize the political power and become the ruler? The British systematically engineered Bengal into a colossal revenue engine. They instituted strict collection of land taxes, assumed monopoly control over essential resources like salt production, and centralized key industries. Crucially, this control extended to Bengal's extensive agricultural system, including the very poppy fields previously used by local farmers for negligible amounts of traditional opium. British agricultural specialists swiftly understood the immense potential. Bengal's specific climate and rich soil were ideal for producing opium of exceptional high-grade quality. Moreover, the existing traditional cultivation methods could be aggressively scaled up. Unlike complex cash crops requiring nuanced international negotiations, opium had one clear, inexhaustible destination: China. In 1773, the company officially founded what they termed the Opium Department. They began offering substantial advance payments to Bengali farmers, incentivizing them to cultivate poppies instead of necessary food crops. Dedicated processing facilities were constructed to refine the raw poppy latex into a stable, smokable form. A rigorous quality control system was implemented to guarantee lethal, consistent potency. Within 10 years, Bengal was exporting 4,000 chests of opium annually, with each chest holding 140 pounds of the refined narcotic. Yet, the true genius of the operation from a strictly corporate standpoint lay in its mechanism for plausible deniability. Officially, the East India Company never directly sold opium into China, an act prohibited by Qing law. Instead, they publicly auctioned the manufactured narcotic to supposedly independent traders in Kolkata. These traders then managed the transport and distribution into China via a patchwork of private high-risk smuggling networks. In reality, these independent traders were often current company employees, recently retired officials, or trusted British merchants operating exclusively under the EIC's military and political protection. The public auction system was nothing more than a strategic legal fiction. All parties involved understood that the company maintained ironclad control over the entire supply chain, while projecting the illusion of arm's-length transactions. Warren Hastings, the company's Governor-General, attempted to justify the arrangement in his official correspondence to London. "It is not for the sake of the revenue that we permit the cultivation of opium, but for the sake of our commercial interests in China." This statement was naturally a complete fabrication. The revenue generated was already enormous and escalating rapidly year after year. The financial data reveals the true prioritization. By 1790, opium sales were generating $7.5 million rupees annually for the EIC, a figure equivalent to roughly $500 million in modern money. This single product constituted 15% of the company's total Indian revenue, surpassing the combined income derived from textile exports, salt taxes, or land revenue gathered from entire provinces. Crucially, opium provided the solution to the long, standing China trade dilemma. For the first time in the history of European engagement with Asia, Britain possessed a product that the Chinese population actively desired. The massive flow of silver that had traveled eastward for centuries now violently reversed its direction, heading west. British merchants operating in Canton began sending back astonished reports of fundamental market changes. Chinese customers who had formerly insisted on being paid in silver were now eagerly offering silver to purchase opium. The narcotic organically generated its own demand. Users required a constant, reliable supply, and mass addiction proved to be a mechanism for customer loyalty far more effective than any conventional marketing strategy. The East India Company responded by scaling up operations aggressively. They mandated the expansion of poppy cultivation throughout Bengal, refined their processing methods, and established rigid, reliable shipping schedules bound for China. Business historians now identify this enterprise as the world's first modern international drug trafficking network, complete with dedicated cultivation zones, centralized processing facilities, specialized distribution channels, and a sophisticated, illegal financial infrastructure. The blatant moral implications did occasionally weigh on certain company officials. David Scott, a company director, confessed in private correspondence, "It is a subject I do not like to dwell upon, but I fear we are deeply responsible for the misery inflicted upon the Chinese people. But such fleeting ethical concerns were never permitted to influence policy. The profits were simply too immense, and the strategic importance of dominating the China trade was paramount." Crucially, the company realized that their narcotics operation required state-level political protection. They knew Chinese officials would eventually attempt to suppress the trafficking, requiring British merchants to have the full backing of their government to persist. The East India Company thus commenced an intensive lobbying effort directed at Parliament and the Crown, seeking official support for what they artfully termed free trade with China. Their core argument was framed around abstract principles. Chinese attempts to prohibit opium violated fundamental tenets of international commerce. They asserted Britain's inherent right to sell any product legally produced, deliberately sidestepping the inconvenient truth that the specific product in question was explicitly illegal under Chinese national law. They successfully cast themselves as stalwart defenders of British commercial rights against arbitrary Chinese protectionism. By 1800, the East India Company had successfully constructed a comprehensive narcotics empire spanning 2 continents. They controlled the cultivation zones in India, the secure shipping lanes across the Indian Ocean, and the established distribution networks within China. Opium had transitioned from an obscure agricultural commodity to the very bedrock of Britain's entire commercial presence in Asia. The company's institutional transformation from a legitimate trading house to a sophisticated, state-backed drug trafficking organization was now absolute. They had perfected the understanding that addiction represented the single most reliable business model in human history. Customers faced a permanent, inescapable need for the product. Demand consistently grew over time, and the users were ultimately forced to pay any price exacted by the supplier. However, this was merely the foundational stage. The East India Company had established the sophisticated supply chain and distribution infrastructure. The next phase required scaling production dramatically and ensuring the creation of widespread mass addiction throughout China itself. Before perfecting the opium model in Asia, the British Empire had already spent 2 centuries perfecting the art of systematic, state-sponsored extraction in the Atlantic. To truly understand the brutality of the East India Company's methods, we must recognize that they were merely repeating a deadly business model first, established on the backs of enslaved people in the West. They had already proven that drug trafficking was profitable. Next, they would prove that it could be officially enshrined as imperial policy. However, to understand the systematic nature of this exploitation, we must pause our journey east and look west, where Britain first perfected the model of brutal, high-profit extraction. Before the Opium Wars in the East, The British Empire had perfected its model of brutal, high-profit exploitation in the West, built on sugar and slavery. The Caribbean islands, such as Jamaica and Barbados, became the empire's jewels of profit because of sugarcane, a crop so valuable, addictive, and labor-intensive that it reshaped the Atlantic world. The cultivation of cane was grueling and relentless, demanding brutal discipline, long hours, and constant replenishment of labor. This led to the horrific transatlantic slave trade, where Britain was responsible for carrying more than $3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The government actively sanctioned this cruelty. In 1672, the Royal African Company received a royal charter, granting it a monopoly over the English slave trade, making it an organized, state-sanctioned enterprise. The wealth of the empire, particularly the rise of port cities like London, Bristol, and Liverpool, was built on these chains. Even when Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, officially freeing the enslaved, the government provided £20 million to compensate the slave owners for the loss of their property. But the former slaves themselves received none of this money. The British Empire's wealth was built on two great systems of exploitation: opium in the east and sugar and slavery in the west. The Caribbean islands, such as Barbados and Jamaica, became the empire's jewels of profit thanks to sugarcane, a crop so valuable and labor-intensive that it reshaped the Atlantic world and bound Britain irreversibly to the transatlantic slave trade. This brutal commerce was an organized, state-sanctioned enterprise. In 1672, the Royal African Company received a royal charter granting it a monopoly over the English slave trade and ushering in an era of large-scale transport of enslaved Africans to the Americas. The cultivation of cane demanded brutal discipline, long hours, and constant replenishment of labor, leading to high mortality rates. The profits were staggering, fueling industrial growth in Britain and making merchants in ports like Liverpool and London immensely wealthy. The moral contradictions became intense. A nation that prided itself on liberty actively sanctioned and profited from human bondage. Even after the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which freed the enslaved, the British government paid £20 million to compensate the slave owners for the loss of their property. But the former slaves did not receive any of this money for themselves. We have seen the economic template established in the West. Now, let's return to the East, where the British prepared to unleash this perfected model of institutionalized exploitation on the largest nation on Earth. The Qing government remained dangerously unaware of the scale of the impending crisis. They were about to confront an unprecedented challenge in their 4,000-year history, an enemy that did not attack with traditional armies or conventional weaponry, but with a substance that designed to psychologically and physically turn their own population against the state. In 1800, the Qing dynasty commanded the largest empire the world had ever seen. China's population neared $300 million, surpassing the combined populace of all European nations. The empire possessed the world's most advanced agricultural sector, sophisticated manufacturing capabilities, and a highly efficient government bureaucracy. For 2,000 years, China had rightfully been regarded as the crown jewel of global civilization, with tribute missions arriving in Beijing from across Asia to acknowledge its regional supremacy. However, Qing officials began receiving disconcerting intelligence from the southern provinces. Reports trickled up from coastal metropolises like Canton and Macau regarding an escalating social epidemic. Foreign merchants were peddling a commodity called foreign mud, which rendered its users sick, lethargic, and economically desperate. This foreign mud was opium, and its visible, corrosive effects were swiftly becoming impossible to dismiss. Chinese users would often recline motionless for extended periods, abandoning their employment, family duties, and social responsibilities. They committed escalating financial resources to the drug, frequently resorting to selling off personal property, taking on immense debt, or outright theft to finance their habits. More alarming still, the addiction appeared structurally permanent. Users rarely achieved lasting recovery, even when possessing a strong will to quit. Emperor Jiaqing began receiving increasingly panicked reports from his provincial governors. In Fujian province, local officials documented 30,000 opium users concentrated in a single district. In Guangdong, the crisis had breached its initial confines, spreading from the indigent labor class to include respected merchants, promising students, and even essential government clerks. Most concerning was the observation that younger citizens were succumbing to addiction more rapidly and severely than their elders. The response from the Chinese central government was both immediate and stringent. As early as 1729, Emperor Yongzheng had outlawed the smoking and sale of opium. His successors continually fortified these laws, escalating penalties for cultivation, processing, and distribution. By 1800, Chinese statutory law mandated death for opium trafficking and severe corporal punishment for recreational use. Yet, effective enforcement proved almost unattainable. Chinese authorities quickly realized they were battling a menace unlike any they had faced before. A criminal network, bolstered by foreign military strength, seemingly limitless financial capital, and highly sophisticated methods of political corruption. British opium traders had expertly learned how to exploit every structural weakness within the complex Chinese system of governance. The British established secure, fortified staging positions on offshore islands beyond the immediate reach of Chinese jurisdiction. They systematically bribed local officials, nurturing expansive networks of corrupt magistrates who deliberately overlooked the trafficking operations in exchange for handsome personal payments. They used swift vessels and powerful armed escorts to easily evade or overpower Chinese patrol boats. Most profoundly, they recognized that the drug itself generated a self-sustaining protection system. Addicted Chinese officials, desperate for their daily supply, became unwitting British allies, ensuring the protection of trafficking routes. Addicted merchants willingly facilitated smuggling logistics. Addicted laborers formed the essential workforce for unloading ships and transporting the illicit cargo inland. The narcotic literally functioned as a tool to convert sovereign Chinese citizens into indispensable British operational assets. Commissioner Lin Zexu emerged as the Chinese official most singularly focused on eradicating the opium catastrophe. Appointed by Emperor Daoguang in 1838, Lin was celebrated for his absolute incorruptibility, sharp intellect, and profound administrative competence. He alone grasped that China confronted not just a severe law enforcement issue, but an imminent existential threat to the state itself. Lin dedicated months to meticulous study of the illicit opium trade before enacting any policy. He interviewed former addicts, scrutinized intercepted British shipping manifests, and calculated the exhaustive economic damage inflicted by the drug imports. His findings were staggering. China was importing 40,000 chests of opium every year, equivalent to $5.6 million pounds of refined narcotic. From this single item, British merchants were extracting profits that rivaled China's entire annual revenue from taxation. Even more alarmingly, Lin observed that the trade was accelerating exponentially. British cultivation zones in India were expanding rapidly. Sophisticated new distribution channels were proliferating, and addiction rates were climbing at exponential speed. Based on current trends, Lin calculated that 10% of China's entire population would be permanently addicted within the next 2 decades. Lin also unearthed a fact that astounded him. The relentless flow of opium had entirely reversed China's long-standing trade surplus. For centuries, China had exported significantly more than it imported, accumulating vast global reserves of silver. Now, opium purchases were depleting Chinese silver reserves so swiftly that the empire faced an imminent monetary collapse. The financial toll was devastating. Between 1,800 and 1,838, China had expended roughly $100 million silver taels on opium imports, valued at approximately $7 billion in today's currency. This silver was extracted directly from the imperial treasury, provincial tax revenues, and private citizen savings. The entire Chinese financial structure was being fundamentally rewired solely to finance British drug profits. Lin penned a direct, impassioned appeal to Queen Victoria, invoking her moral conscience. "Your country lies 20,000 li away, but for all that the way of heaven holds good for you, as for us, and your instincts are not different from ours, for nowhere are there men so blind as not to distinguish between what brings profit and what does harm." Lin's letter received no reply. British officials were perfectly cognizant of the ruin their trade was causing. They simply chose not to care. The financial incentive was overwhelming, and China's structural weakness represented an irresistible opportunity for deeper exploitation. But Lin was not content merely to rely on diplomatic appeals. He was meticulously planning the most extensive anti-narcotics campaign ever launched in Chinese history. Collaborating with trusted, loyal officials across the southern provinces, Lin established a tightly coordinated enforcement network designed to intercept British shipments, apprehend Chinese collaborators, and physically destroy all existing opium stocks. In March 1839, Lin arrived in Canton, wielding emergency imperial authority. He immediately ordered the surrounding of the foreign trading quarter and demanded that British merchants surrender their entire opium inventory, not merely the current shipment, but every chest, alongside signed commitments never to engage in opium importation again. The British merchants were stunned into incredulity. For decades, they had conducted their illegal business freely in Chinese waters, paying bribes and flouting Qing law with absolute impunity. Now, a Chinese official was demanding strict compliance with Chinese law on Chinese soil. The sheer audacity of this move was unprecedented. Lin granted them 3 days to comply. When the deadline passed and they refused, he immediately sealed off the foreign quarter, halted all food deliveries, and detained the British traders until the opium was surrendered. He was not interested in negotiation. He was exercising Chinese sovereignty within China's borders. The siege endured for 6 weeks. British merchants initially banked on intervention from their government, yet no immediate military rescue arrived. Isolated, critically low on provisions, and facing mounting pressure from hostile Chinese crowds, they finally conceded. The capitulation was complete. British merchants delivered 20,283 chests of opium, totaling $2.66 million of refined narcotic. Valued at $30 million at the time, or $900 million in present-day currency, Lin had executed the single largest drug seizure ever recorded in human history. Confiscation, however, was merely the first step. Lin mandated that the opium be destroyed completely, in a way that precluded any chance of recovery or resale. Chinese workers methodically mixed the vast quantities of opium with salt and lime, then washed the resulting slurry directly into the Pearl River. The process of destruction required 23 continuous days, with throngs of Chinese citizens watching the foreign poison dissipate into harmless sludge. Lin dispatched detailed accounts to Beijing, celebrating the operation's comprehensive success. He had successfully liquidated the British opium stockpile, detained crucial Chinese co-percenter conspirators, and unequivocally demonstrated that foreign merchants were not immune to Chinese law. To the Qing government, the opium crisis seemed definitively resolved, but Commissioner Lin had made a fatal miscalculation. He had accurately identified British drug trafficking as a crime problem, when in fact, it was the execution of a critical imperial strategy. The British agents were not simply profit-seeking merchants. They were the vanguard of an empire aiming for total dominance. Lin's impressive success in Canton was about to unleash a retaliatory catastrophe he had failed to foresee. The British government would cynically leverage Lin's lawful enforcement of Chinese regulations as explicit justification for a full-scale military invasion of China. They would publicly assert that Chinese attempts to curb British drug trafficking constituted a violation of international trade principles, thereby warranting armed retaliation. The most formidable empire in Chinese history was about to learn that combating drug smugglers protected by the Royal Navy demanded far more than moral rectitude and administrative competence. They required a willingness to match British ruthlessness with Chinese brutality, a willingness they fatally lacked. The Opium Wars were now imminent. Charles Elliot received the urgent dispatches in November 1839, confirming that Chinese authorities had seized and destroyed 20,283 chests of British opium, representing $1 million of pounds sterling in assets. As Britain's chief superintendent of trade in China, Elliot confronted a decision that would dramatically reshape the geopolitical order. He possessed the option of acknowledging the Chinese law enforcement action as legitimate and attempting to negotiate fair compensation for the destroyed contraband. This course would honor China's sovereignty over its own territory and effectively terminate the destructive opium trade forever. Or he could deliberately frame Chinese drug enforcement as an act of aggressive war against British commercial interests, thereby justifying military reprisal. Elliot chose the path of war. His official justification was meticulously tailored for consumption by London audiences. He argued that Chinese authorities had not merely seized illegal narcotics, they had violently violated British property rights and wrongfully detained British subjects. It was irrelevant that the property was explicitly illegal under Chinese statutes, and the subjects were incarcerated for large-scale drug trafficking. Elliot successfully twisted China's necessary act of law enforcement into an unprovoked act of aggression against Great Britain. This deceitful argument resonated because it perfectly aligned with the overarching British imperial strategy. The East India Company had invested $1 million over decades to construct its opium supply chain, demanding predictable returns for its shareholders, not disruption from Chinese authorities. Furthermore, high-ranking British officials understood that opium represented something far greater than simple drug revenue. It was a mechanism to assert permanent economic dominance over China's vast market. If China successfully banned opium, they might subsequently outlaw other British goods or permanently expel British merchants entirely. The opium trade was, therefore, the pivotal test case for British economic penetration. In London, Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston received Elliot's urgent communications and instantly absorbed the strategic ramifications. China was challenging not merely British drug smuggling, but the broader project of British imperial expansion across Asia. If Britain conceded to Chinese authority over trade policies, other Asian nations would inevitably emulate China's defiance and restrict British commerce. Palmerston drafted Britain's formal, aggressive response to Commissioner Lin's seizure. The British government cannot allow its subjects to be treated with such violence and injustice without seeking satisfaction. The language used was intentionally misleading. British subjects had been handled strictly according to Chinese law for violating Chinese anti-narcotics prohibitions within Chinese sovereign territory. However, Palmerston's true strategy was far more sophisticated. He repositioned the entire conflict, making it about free trade rather than drug trafficking. British merchants, he asserted, must retain the liberty to sell any product deemed legal in international commerce. Chinese attempts to prohibit specific imports, he claimed, fundamentally violated the principles of international commerce. This argument possessed one critical, inherent flaw. Opium was definitively not a legal commodity under Chinese jurisdiction. Palmerston circumvented this problem by declaring that Chinese law itself was illegitimate. China, he proclaimed, had no right to ban imports because such prohibitions contravened the natural universally applicable principles of free trade principles that, in the British view, automatically superseded any conflicting local legislation. This legal theory that British commercial profits took precedence over the inherent sovereignty of the Chinese nation served as the intellectual bedrock justifying subsequent military intervention. Parliament engaged in heated debate regarding support for armed action in China, with Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston forcefully arguing that Chinese outrages against British trade warranted a defensive war. This dramatic parliamentary exchange immediately exposed the profound moral hypocrisy underpinning British foreign policy. William Gladstone, then a burgeoning Member of Parliament, articulated the obvious moral failing. Gladstone's assessment was precisely correct. Opium consumption was strictly forbidden within the British Empire itself. The government acknowledged its inherent danger to British citizens, yet simultaneously asserted a unilateral right to sell it en masse to the Chinese population. British domestic law outlawed opium use for its own populace, while British imperial policy aggressively mandated access to the drug for Chinese subjects. However, moral clarity proved utterly incapable of competing with the staggering economic imperatives. The powerful East India Company, EIC, calculated that its expansive Chinese operations generated approximately £3.7 million annually, a sum roughly equivalent to $400 million in contemporary presented value. This immense revenue stream financed EIC operations throughout the whole of Asia, sustained thousands of British jobs, and contributed significantly to the coffers of the British Treasury through tax receipts. Crucially, the opium trade had completely resolved Britain's fundamental decades-long problem with Sino-British commerce. Prior to the drug trade, Britain suffered a massive silver deficit, continuously exporting silver bullion to purchase desirable Chinese goods like tea and porcelain without adequate reciprocity. Following the introduction of opium, the flow was dramatically reversed. Chinese silver now streamed into British hands in exchange for British-controlled narcotics. The drug trade had engineered a complete reversal of the foundational economic relationship. Parliament ultimately voted 271 to 262 to endorse military action against China. The extremely narrow margin of victory underscored the genuine ethical anxieties surrounding Britain's first, explicitly drug-motivated conflict, but the majority recognized that retreat would mean the destruction of Britain's most lucrative Asian enterprise and establish a dangerous precedent for successful Chinese resistance to Western commerce. The Royal Navy immediately commenced assembling what they officially designated the China Expeditionary Force. This formidable assembly comprised 16 warships, 4,000 professional Marines, and cutting-edge military technology, notably including the newly commissioned iron-hulled steamer Nemesis, the very first iron warship ever deployed in combat. British military strategists operated with the clear understanding that they possessed overwhelming technological dominance. Chinese naval capabilities relied heavily on traditional wooden junks and outdated, smooth-bore artillery. Furthermore, Chinese coastal defenses had been constructed to repel historical threats, offering little resistance against modern naval bombardment techniques. British forces enjoyed the operational flexibility to strike virtually anywhere along China's vast coastline, forcing Chinese defenses into a hopeless position of attempting to defend every point simultaneously. Yet, technology was not Britain's sole advantage. The opium trade itself had organically generated extensive intelligence networks across coastal China. Corrupt and addicted local officials readily provided vital operational intelligence regarding Chinese military movements and preparations. Chinese smugglers offered granular, detailed knowledge of crucial harbors, treacherous currents, and vulnerable defensive positions. The complex drug network had seamlessly transformed into a sophisticated spy network. British commanders also acutely recognized that widespread opium addiction had profoundly degraded Chinese military effectiveness. Reports filtering back from Canton detailed accounts of Chinese soldiers too heavily intoxicated to perform basic duties, officers routinely selling essential military supplies to fund their own drug habits, and entire units becoming structurally unreliable during periods of crisis. Captain Charles Elliot, tasked with commanding British naval forces, received unequivocal instructions directly from London. They were to forcibly reopen the opium trade, secure financial compensation for all destroyed contraband, and establish permanent British rights of access to Chinese markets. This war was not initiated to punish Chinese aggression. Its explicit purpose was to establish enduring British commercial dominance. The first major confrontation took place at Tuen-Pi in January 1841. British warships methodically bombarded the Chinese fortifications, while Chinese return fire ricocheted harmlessly off the reinforced British iron hulls. The technological disparity was so devastatingly wide that Chinese defenders soon began referring to the British vessels as devil vessels, immune to conventional weaponry. Within a few short hours, British forces had obliterated ancient fortifications that had protected Chinese territory for centuries. The Nemesis, propelled by steam engines and armed with advanced artillery, single-handedly decimated an entire Chinese fleet. Chinese military resistance collapsed, not from a lack of courage, but from irrecoverable technological obsolescence. Crucially, the British strategy extended far beyond mere military triumph. They deliberately targeted China's economic infrastructure, imposing blockades on major trading ports and severely disrupting internal trade routes. The core objective was demonstrating that Chinese national prosperity rested fundamentally upon British goodwill. Any resistance to British commerce would be met with swift economic strangulation. The strategy proved spectacularly effective. Chinese merchants, who had previously supported Commissioner Lin's anti-opium campaign, swiftly began lobbying the central government for a rapid compromise. They prioritized access to vital international markets over the imperative to halt foreign drug trafficking. Economic warfare thus proved to be a more effective instrument than outright military campaigns. Commissioner Lin Zexu, watching his comprehensive anti-drug policy disintegrate under British naval bombardment, wrote a bitter dispatch to Beijing. "The English barbarians have shown their true nature. They care nothing for justice, morality, or the welfare of our people. They desire only profit, and they will use force to secure it." Lin's analysis was tragically accurate, but this realization arrived too late. The British had just demonstrated a paradigm shift that would irrevocably reshape international relations. A technologically superior power could unilaterally impose its economic preferences through brute military force, regardless of local domestic law, national sovereignty, or moral considerations. The Opium Wars established a definitive new structure of global power. Britain had perfected a comprehensive system of narco-imperialism, an economic system where market access was violently enforced by the Royal Navy, local sovereignty was ignored, and the most profitable business model was the systematic poisoning of a population. The Chinese were learning a devastating lesson that would resonate throughout the following century. In the industrial world, military technology decisively determined commercial rights. Britain's ability to destroy Chinese defenses gave them the perceived right to systematically poison Chinese citizens. Superior firepower inevitably trumped moral authority, legal sovereignty, and even basic human decency. The First Opium War was nearing its conclusion, but its catastrophic consequences were just beginning to unfold. The financial figures emerging from China astonished even the most seasoned British merchants. By 1838, opium importation had successfully reversed the entire historical flow of silver between Britain and China. For the first time in recorded history, A greater quantity of Chinese silver bullion was flowing westward to Britain than flowing eastward into China. The transformation in trade dynamics was staggering, both in its velocity and its sheer scale. In 1800, China had imported an estimated 4,000 chests of opium annually. By 1838, that figure had ballooned tenfold to a massive 40,000 chests in a span of less than 4 decades. Given that each chest contained 140 pounds of refined narcotic, China was absorbing approximately $5.6 million pounds of opium every year. Yet, the true devastation was not measured in narcotic quantities, but in the catastrophic outflow of silver. Chinese customers were required to pay for opium exclusively in silver, and the prices demanded were astronomical. A single chest of opium could command between 600 and 800 silver taels, depending on the quality and market conditions. With 40,000 chests imported yearly, Chinese consumers collectively spent an estimated $24 to $32 million silver taels annually on British narcotics. To properly gauge this monumental expenditure, China's total annual tax revenue at the time was roughly $40 million silver taels. This meant that Chinese citizens were dedicating nearly 80% of their national government's entire operational budget to purchasing a single imported product that offered absolutely no measurable economic utility. This massive capital was not being invested in infrastructure, technology, or productive commodities. It was solely financing addiction. The East India Company's financial ledgers recounted this saga with brutal clarity. By 1838, opium sales generated £3.7 million annually for the company, roughly $400 million today. This solitary product line generated more net profit than all of the EIC's other operations across Asia combined. Opium had swiftly become Britain's single most valuable export, surpassing the profitability of textiles, manufactured goods, and traditional trading staples. Even more remarkable was the fact that opium profits represented virtually pure profit. The East India Company exerted total control over every stage of production. They owned the specific land where the poppies were cultivated, employed the farmers who tended them, managed the facilities that processed the raw material, and commanded the ships that transported the final product. Production overheads were minimal, labor costs were cheap and abundant, land was plentiful, and the processing technology required was rudimentary. The resulting profit margins were unprecedented in the history of global commerce. Raw opium cost approximately 40 rupees per chest to produce in Bengal. That same chest was then sold for up to 800 silver taels in Canton, a markup approximating 2,000%. No legitimate, conventional business had ever achieved such extraordinary profit margins at such a massive volume. British merchants understood that they had created a revolutionary business model, a product that generated its own relentless demand, required no marketing or competitive pricing, and commanded whatever exorbitant price they chose to charge. Addicted customers would willingly pay any amount, borrow any sum, or steal whatever was necessary to purchase their next supply. The massive silver drain created cascading, devastating economic effects throughout China. Provincial governments found themselves increasingly unable to collect necessary taxes because citizens were diverting their available funds to opium purchases instead of fulfilling tax obligations. Merchants could no longer afford to stock legitimate, productive goods because their customer base preferred spending their meager income on drugs. Agricultural regions began experiencing severe labor shortages as workers became too addicted and unreliable to farm effectively. Chinese economic advisors quickly recognized that they were confronting an unprecedented crisis. Traditional economic theory assumed that imports provided quantifiable value tools, materials, or goods that enhanced domestic productivity. But opium imports provided demonstrably negative value. They bled currency out of the economy, while simultaneously crippling domestic productivity and generating immense social costs related to managing addiction. Emperor Dao Guang received increasingly desperate communications from regional governors detailing the rapid pace of local economic collapse. In Fujian province, tax revenue had plummeted by 40% as citizens allocated their money toward opium. In Guangdong, traditional manufacturing was collapsing because the workforce was unreliable and the customer base was impoverished. The emperor convened special economic councils to urgently study the silver drain phenomenon. Court economists calculated that, maintaining the current pace of opium importation, the Qing Empire would fully exhaust its accumulated silver reserves within 2 decades. The vast empire that had meticulously accumulated global silver for centuries, through superior manufacturing and trade, was now catastrophically hemorrhaging its wealth to acquire British lastadi, cultivated narcotics. The British Empire had staked its prestige on finance, but this very pride led to its ultimate undoing. Following World War I, Britain was drowning in debt. Crucially, much of it owed to the United States. Despite this new reality, the financial elite was driven by a desperate psychological hunger to return the pound to its pre-war value of 4.86 against the dollar, a rate that overvalued the currency by about 10%. This decision, largely driven by Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the Bank of England, was driven by pride and a desire to maintain London's status. The brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes warned Churchill, "If you do this, you are declaring war on the working class. You will force employers to slash wages, and that will lead to strikes, social chaos, and the destruction of British industry." Churchill chose the advice of the bankers over the warning of the economist. Keynes's prediction came true immediately. To maintain the artificial value of the pound, companies slashed wages, directly causing the massive general strike of 1926. The government chose to sacrifice the real economy of factories and workers on the altar of financial prestige. The suffering of the last decade was for nothing. The financial exhaustion led to profound political humiliation, exemplified by the Suez Crisis in 1956. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, along with France and Israel, intervened militarily, but was forced to withdraw under pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union. This humiliation exposed Britain's diminished global influence and confirmed that the age of unilateral imperial adventures was over. The empire was financially liquidated, and the true beginning of the American century had dawned. The cost of defending a currency symbol had fatally weakened the industrial and moral base of the empire itself. Chinese officials attempted various economic interventions before ultimately resorting to prohibition. They initially tried taxing opium imports, hoping to reduce consumption while generating desperately needed government revenue. But taxation proved impossible. Opium was already outlawed, meaning there was no legal framework whatsoever for taxing contraband goods. They briefly considered establishing a government-controlled opium distribution system, similar to salt or liquor monopolies. This measure would have theoretically eliminated foreign merchants while retaining revenue domestically. However, Emperor Dao Guang emphatically rejected this proposal on profound moral grounds. The government should not profit from citizen addiction, even if foreign traders were already doing so. They explored import substitution, encouraging widespread domestic poppy cultivation to replace foreign opium supply. Chinese agricultural experts confirmed that domestic poppies could yield opium comparable in quality to the Bengal varieties. This solution, however, would only exacerbate the addiction crisis, merely keeping the diverted wealth within China instead of channeling it toward productive uses. Finally, they exhausted diplomatic efforts. Chinese officials approached British representatives requesting a voluntary, phased reduction of opium imports. They even offered to purchase equivalent quantities of legitimate British products if the merchants would abandon drug trafficking. British merchants politely but firmly refused. Nothing Britain produced, they knew, was remotely as profitable as addiction. The relentless silver drain also created deep geopolitical vulnerabilities that Chinese strategists were beginning to grasp. China's military capacity had historically depended heavily on their ability to purchase advanced weaponry, hire foreign military advisors, and fund necessary defensive preparations using their silver reserves. Yet, opium imports were systematically depleting the precise financial resources required for national defense. Worse, the British were actively utilizing opium profits to finance their own military modernization. The Royal Navy's rapid expansion, the East India Company's large private armies, and Britain's complex global imperial operations were all partially subsidized through the Chinese silver spent on British narcotics. China was literally funding the military forces that would soon be deployed against it. British strategists understood this cynical dynamic perfectly. Lord Palmerston famously wrote in a private correspondence, "The Chinese are purchasing the rope with which we shall hang them." Chinese silver spent on British opium instantly became British military expenditure, exponentially enhancing British power relative to China. The economic warfare was functioning exactly as Britain intended. They had successfully engineered a financial system where Chinese national wealth automatically transferred into British imperial control. Chinese domestic productivity declined sharply through widespread addiction, and Chinese military capabilities were severely undermined by financial resource depletion. Opium was not merely profitable, it was a strategically brilliant tool of conquest. Commissioner Lin Zexu articulated the ultimate implications in his final, desperate report to Emperor Dao Guang. "If we do not stop the opium trade immediately, China will have no soldiers for defense, no money for government, and no people capable of production. This is not trade. This is economic conquest through systematic poisoning." Lin was absolutely correct, but his acute analysis arrived far too late. The silver had already flowed, the epidemic of addiction was already established, and the British military forces, substantially funded by Chinese opium purchases, were already approaching Chinese territorial waters. The First Opium War would prove decisively that economic warfare could be far more devastating than traditional military conquest. Britain had discovered a novel method of seizing an empire without physically occupying its territory by compelling its people to destroy themselves. The cabinet meeting of the 1st of October 1839 would serve as the pivotal moment determining whether the British Crown would officially endorse drug trafficking as a legitimate imperial policy. Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston faced a chamber filled with Britain's most influential officials, each representing powerful interests in what everyone acknowledged was a conflict about far more than just opium. Prime Minister Lord Melbourne opened the proceedings by reading Commissioner Lin's eloquent letter, addressed to Queen Victoria, the Chinese officials' appeal for moral reflection on the opium trade's destructive impact on the Chinese people. The letter was articulate, logically reasoned, and devastating in its moral clarity. It expertly exposed the fundamental contradiction in British policy, demanding the unquestioned right to sell narcotics to Chinese citizens, while simultaneously banning that very drug for its own populace. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Thomas Spring Rice, then presented the decisive economic rationale. The East India Company's opium trade generated £3.7 million annually, constituting approximately 15% of the company's entire revenue derived from India. This money underpinned critical British operations across Asia, supported thousands of domestic jobs, and contributed immensely to the Treasury via company taxation and dividend payments. More critically, Rice explained, the opium trade had solved Britain's most persistent economic obstacle. Historically, Chinese markets had drained British silver reserves because China manufactured virtually everything better and cheaper than European competitors. Opium had reversed this dynamic entirely. Chinese silver now flowed into Britain, directly funding burgeoning industrial expansion and global imperial ventures. War Secretary Lord Hill outlined the geopolitical implications. Chinese resistance to British commerce could simply not be tolerated. as it risked establishing a dangerous precedent for other Asian powers. If China successfully managed to ban British imports, similar restrictions might rapidly proliferate across Asia, potentially eradicating Britain's most profitable overseas markets. Hill also emphasized Britain's overwhelming technological advantages. British naval supremacy in Asian waters was an established fact. Chinese military forces utilized obsolete equipment and outdated tactics. A swift, decisive military campaign would unequivocally demonstrate British power while securing permanent commercial privileges. The anticipated costs, he argued, would be negligible compared to the colossal potential profits. However, several cabinet members voiced serious moral reservations. Lord Ashley, speaking for the influential evangelical Christian bloc in Parliament, argued passionately that Britain could not ethically justify selling highly addictive narcotics to foreign populations while simultaneously funding Christian missionary activities there. How could British missionaries credibly preach moral salvation while British merchants delivered spiritual damnation? Home Secretary Lord Normanby raised practical concerns regarding domestic public opinion. Parliamentary discussions about policy in China were attracting significant scrutiny, with opposition figures like William Gladstone delivering ruinous speeches about Britain's descent into becoming a state-sponsored drug trafficking organization. The government needed highly convincing justifications for what appeared to be an indefensibly immoral war. Palmerston grasped that the cabinet's decision would establish sweeping precedents far exceeding mere Chinese policy. Britain was swiftly evolving into a global imperial power, encountering resistance to British commerce in numerous regions simultaneously. The Chinese situation would serve as the ultimate test. Would Britain respect local sovereignty over trade, or would it impose British commercial preferences through the use of force? Palmerston's argument was ingeniously engineered to address both the moral qualms and the strategic imperatives. He skillfully framed Chinese resistance not as legitimate drug enforcement, but as hostile commercial aggression against rightful British interests. Chinese authorities, he argued, had not merely seized illegal narcotics, they had violated sacred property rights and arbitrarily imprisoned British subjects without due process. This framing allowed cabinet members to vote for military action while maintaining an outwardly moral justification. They were not endorsing drug trafficking, but rather defending British citizens against Chinese violations of international law. The inconvenient fact that the citizens were drug traffickers and the violations were merely the enforcement of Chinese domestic law was conveniently overlooked. Palmerston also invoked the sacrosanct principle of free trade. British merchants, he declared, must be permitted to sell any commercially viable product in international markets without improper interference from local governments. Chinese attempts to ban specific imports violated natural economic laws that he claimed transcended national sovereignty. The free trade argument was obviously flawed. Opium was illegal under Chinese law, and Britain itself banned opium domestically, HMS. But Palmerston resolved this contradiction by asserting that Chinese law was inherently invalid because it conflicted with superior British commercial interests. Local sovereignty, he concluded, could not supersede fundamental British economic rights. Chancellor Rice provided crucial backing by detailing the financial ramifications of backing down. If Britain accepted Chinese authority over trade, similar restrictions might quickly spread throughout Asia. The potential loss of Asian markets could cost Britain million-dollar-s of pounds annually, simultaneously strengthening rivals like France, Russia, and the United States. More alarmingly, Rice argued that Chinese success in resisting British commerce might embolden similar resistance in India, where the East India Company's authority relied entirely on the perceived invincibility of the British Empire. Accepting Chinese defiance could potentially trigger independence movements across Britain's vast Asian territories. The strategic argument proved absolutely decisive. Cabinet members may have harbored moral reservations regarding drug trafficking, but they simply could not overlook existential threats to British imperial authority. China was challenging not just opium sales, but Britain's perceived right to impose commercial terms on all Asian markets. Foreign Minister Palmerston summarized the government's consensus position. British subjects have been illegally detained, British property has been arbitrarily seized, and British commerce has been unlawfully restricted. Her Majesty's government cannot permit such outrages without seeking appropriate satisfaction. The language was meticulously chosen to obscure the moral issues, while emphasizing legal and proprietary grievances. The British subjects were drug traffickers, the British property was contraband narcotics, and the British commerce was, in fact, illegal under Chinese statutes. Yet, Palmerston's expert formulation made legitimate Chinese law enforcement sound like an act of aggression against Britain. Prime Minister Melbourne called for a formal vote. The Cabinet voted 8-3 to support immediate military action against China, with the religious-minded members forming the opposing minority. The Crown had thus officially elevated drug trafficking to the level of legitimate imperial policy. Queen Victoria herself never offered a public opinion on the opium trade, maintaining constitutional silence regarding government policy. However, her private correspondence reveals clear awareness of the moral implications. She wrote to her advisor, Baron Stockmar, "The China question troubles me greatly. I cannot reconcile my conscience to some aspects of our commercial interests." But Victoria's personal concerns did not translate into political opposition. The Crown's financial interests were inextricably aligned with the government's decision, as royal revenues depended partly on imperial profits, including those generated through opium sales. Economic necessity unequivocally outweighed moral reservation. The cabinet decision triggered immediate implementation across the government apparatus. Admiral Thomas Cochrane received urgent orders to assemble naval forces for the China operation. The War Department began recruiting substantial marine contingents for anticipated amphibious operations. The East India Company received formal authorization to coordinate military action directly with its commercial objectives. Most critically, the Cabinet authorized the Elliott Instructions detailed guidelines for Britain's negotiating position with Chinese authorities. These instructions revealed the vast true scope of British objectives, which extended far beyond merely resuming opium sales. Britain demanded permanent territorial concessions, extraterritorial rights protecting British citizens from Chinese law, massive indemnity payments for the destroyed opium, and guaranteed complete access to all Chinese markets. The instructions envisioned transforming China from a sovereign empire into a dependent commercial appendage of the British Empire. Parliamentary opposition immediately challenged the Cabinet's decision. Gladstone delivered his famous, scathing speech denouncing this infamous and atrocious war, waged to force British narcotics upon the Chinese people. But Parliament ultimately backed the government by a narrow margin, prioritizing perceived imperial interests and financial stability over moral scrutiny. The Crown's decision established fundamental precedents that would define British imperial policy for the next century. Local sovereignty was subordinate to British commercial interests. Military force was an acceptable and routine tool for securing trade advantages, and drug trafficking was considered legitimate if it served broader strategic imperial objectives. The Opium Wars were not an aberration in British imperial policy, they were the logical, ruthless culmination of principles that prioritized British wealth and power above all other considerations, including basic human decency. The Royal Navy was already sailing toward Chinese waters, carrying orders that would reshape the global balance of power and solidify Britain's status as history's most successful narco empire. HMS Voyage approached the mouth of the Pearl River estuary at dawn on the 3rd of November, 1839, flying battle flags and clearing for immediate action. Captain Henry Smith commanded not merely a warship, but the vanguard of history's first dedicated drug war. a military campaign explicitly engineered to enforce the sale of narcotics upon an unwilling population. The British fleet gathered off Hong Kong represented an unprecedented concentration of naval power mobilized for commercial rather than traditional territorial goals. The expedition comprised 16 warships, including the revolutionary iron-hulled steamer Nemesis, alongside 4,000 Marines and the most advanced military technology available in 1839. Yet, their overarching mission was not traditional conquest. It was the lethal enforcement of market access through systematic, targeted violence. Captain Charles Elliot, commanding the entire expedition, carried explicit, detailed instructions from London, outlining British objectives: resume opium sales, secure financial indemnity for the destroyed drugs, establish permanent British trading privileges, and violently demonstrate the consequences of resisting British commerce. The stated war aims were overwhelmingly commercial, with military might serving economic, not territorial, ambition. The technological chasm separating British and Chinese forces was so profound that military historians now categorize the First Opium War as the earliest, clearest example of modern asymmetric warfare. British vessels utilized iron armor, reliable steam propulsion, explosive shells, and precision modern artillery capable of accurately targeting fortifications from distances far beyond Chinese response capabilities. Chinese naval assets relied on traditional wooden junks, smooth bore cannons, and defensive tactics conceived for historic threats. Their ships were, quite literally, floating targets for the British technology. Chinese return fire consistently bounced harmlessly off the reinforced British iron hulls, while British explosive shells routinely devastated Chinese vessels with single, decisive hits. The Nemesis alone demonstrated a technological superiority that Chinese observers often described as supernatural. Powered by steam engines that rendered it independent of adverse wind conditions, protected by iron plates that deflected traditional artillery, and armed with modern cannons that could demolish Chinese fortifications from safe distances, the ship appeared utterly immune to conventional warfare. British military doctrine recognized their overwhelming advantage, but heavily emphasized speed, decisiveness, and psychological impact over prolonged engagements. The goal was to demonstrate irresistible British power quickly, thereby minimizing both costs and negative international scrutiny. Rapid victories would prove that resistance was futile while limiting negative publicity about Britain's drug trafficking war. The initial engagement at Chuanbi revealed Chinese military obsolescence with shocking clarity. Chinese coastal fortifications, designed to repel traditional sailing attacks, swiftly crumbled under modern British bombardment within hours. Chinese artillery crews watched in despair as their cannonballs rebounded harmlessly off British ships, while British explosive shells demolished their positions. Chinese Admiral Guantan, commanding defensive operations, wrote desperately to Beijing, describing weapons that seemed to violate natural laws. He continued, "The foreign ships move without wind. Their hulls resist our strongest cannons, and their shells explode inside our fortifications like thunder from clear skies. We face enemies who possess powers beyond our understanding." Guantan was not witnessing supernatural phenomena. He was experiencing the first application of industrial military technologies used against static pre-day industrial forces. But the psychological effect was devastating for Chinese defenders, who had never encountered steam propulsion, iron armor, or high explosive ordnance. British commanders ruthlessly exploited this technological ignorance. They strategically positioned their ships to maximize the visual impact of steam propulsion, used explosive shells primarily for their psychological rather than purely tactical effects, and timed operations to suggest an uncanny control over natural elements. The Nemesis proved especially effective at psychological warfare. Captain W.H. Hall described using the ship's steam power to remain perfectly stationary amidst strong tidal currents, creating the pervasive impression of supernatural stability. Chinese observers genuinely believed they were fighting vessels controlled by foreign spirits or demons. But British strategy extended beyond simple technological intimidation. Elliot understood that securing permanent commercial advantages required comprehensively destroying Chinese confidence in their government's capacity to offer protection. Military victories had to demonstrate not just British strength, but profound Chinese governmental incompetence. British forces therefore systematically targeted symbols of imperial authority: coastal forts, government administrative buildings, military installations, and imperial monuments. The objective was undermining Chinese faith in their traditional political system, while simultaneously positioning British merchants as the only reliable partners for China's economic future. The strategy worked flawlessly. Chinese merchants, who had initially supported Commissioner Lin's resolute anti-opium campaign, rapidly began questioning the capabilities of their own government. If Chinese authorities lacked the power to protect Chinese territory from foreign attack, they reasoned, how could they possibly protect Chinese commerce from foreign competition? Chinese officials found themselves caught between two impossible alternatives. Prolonged resistance promised nothing but military ruin and economic collapse. Yet, capitulation demanded accepting foreign dominance over China's domestic policies, specifically the forced legalization of drug trafficking, a practice that blatantly defied Chinese law and moral norms. Emperor Daoguang received increasingly frantic dispatches from the war zones, detailing a chasm of technological disparity that rendered any sustained defense futile. The defeat of the Chinese forces was not rooted in cowardice or tactical incompetence. Rather, it stemmed from systemic, technological antiquity. The emperor convened immediate emergency sessions with his top military advisors, urgently seeking viable strategies for asymmetric resistance against Britain's overwhelming technological superiority. Recommendations varied. Some proposed adopting decentralized guerrilla warfare. Others favored renewed diplomatic engagement, while a few suggested superficial compliance with British demands while secretly plotting future retribution. Inevitably, all Chinese strategies collided with the same fundamental, unyielding problem. Britain commanded the seas, wielded vastly superior weaponry, and could strike at will along China's immense coastline. Meanwhile, Chinese forces were forced into the impossible position of defending every point simultaneously. China's traditional military advantages, sheer numbers, defensive terrain, and established supply lines were utterly nullified by the might of modern naval power. British merchants, closely embedded within the advancing military forces, immediately began assessing the lucrative commercial opportunities generated by China's military collapse. The disruption of established traditional trade networks created immediate, critical openings for British manufactured goods. Furthermore, the newly weakened Chinese authorities lacked the capacity to enforce regulations limiting foreign business activities. Military conquest was rapidly achieving the precise level of market penetration that the original opium ventures had been intended to secure. Agents from the East India Company traveled alongside the British military, systematically identifying potential markets, assessing local economic stability, and negotiating initial trade agreements with Chinese merchants desperate for foreign protection. The military conquest was instantaneously translated into deep commercial penetration. Crucially, the British demonstration of force proved that China's prohibition on opium was utterly unenforceable when challenged by organized foreign military power. Chinese officials could outlaw drug sales, detain Chinese collaborators, or even destroy foreign drug stockpiles. But they possessed no means to prevent armed foreign merchants from imposing their commercial demands backed by superior military technology. Captain Elliot relayed the stark reality to London. The Chinese have been forced to recognize that their ancient empire cannot withstand modern commerce supported by modern military might. They face a choice: either accept British trade demands or witness the incineration of their coastal cities. The conflict had transcended the simple matter of opium. It had become a fundamental question of whether China could retain sovereignty over its domestic economic policy, or whether it must submit to British control over its vast markets. The illegal drug trade served as the definitive test case for imperial supremacy, cleverly masked as a struggle for commercial freedom. Chinese resistance was faltering not due to tactical military defeats, but because of technological impossibility. They were unable to fight weapons they failed to comprehend, using tactics designed for a technologically equal opponent. The First Opium War emphatically demonstrated that military technology was the true arbiter of commercial rights in the dawning modern era. Britain's victory was guaranteed the moment steam-powered iron-clad warships entered China's territorial waters. The only uncertainty remaining was whether the Chinese leadership would choose swift surrender or endure the slow collapse of their empire while absorbing the same painful lesson. The age of decisive European technological superiority over Asian civilizations had dawned, and its initial application involved coercing the sale of narcotics onto an unwilling populace. The ominous template was now established. Advanced military capability justified any commercial objective, entirely disregarding local law, national sovereignty, or fundamental human decency. The cabinet meeting scheduled for October 1, 1839, would definitively determine whether the British Crown would formally endorse systematic drug trafficking as an official imperial policy. Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston addressed a room crowded with Britain's most influential officials, each representing distinct, powerful interests in a conflict that everyone present understood extended far beyond the confines of the opium trade. The Treaty of Nanking, signed aboard HMS Cornwallis on the 29th of August 1842, represented far more than the conclusion of the First Opium War. It served as the foundational blueprint for the economic colonialism that European powers would ruthlessly employ to dominate Asia for the next 100 years. Chinese negotiator Qi Ying confronted British plenipotentiary Henry Pottinger across a table burdened with demands, terms that would have been unimaginable before British warships so decisively exposed China's military obsolescence. This treaty was hardly a negotiation between sovereign equals. It was the unilateral dictation of terms to a vanquished power that had just learned the staggering cost of resisting British commerce. The initial demand was financial. China was mandated to pay an indemnity totaling $21 million silver taels, an amount equivalent to approximately $3.2 billion today. This sum was broken down into $6 million for the destroyed opium, $6 million to cover British military expenditures, and $9 million to settle the debts owed by Chinese merchants to their British counterparts. The inherent hypocrisy was glaring. China was compelled to reimburse Britain for the very costs of the war that Britain had initiated, specifically to force narcotic sales upon the Chinese populace. These financial conditions alone guaranteed the severe depletion of the Chinese treasury for decades. Considering that the entire annual tax revenue of the Chinese government totaled only about $40 million silver taels, the indemnity represented more than 6 months of the state's total income. China would consequently be forced to seek international loans or dramatically increase domestic taxes, merely to pay Britain for the privilege of its own military defeat. Nevertheless, even the ruinous financial demands paled in comparison to the territorial concessions, which fundamentally and permanently compromised Chinese sovereignty. Britain extracted the demand for the perpetual possession of Hong Kong Island, a crucial strategic harbour destined to become the nerve centre for all British commercial and military operations across Asia. Hong Kong was far more than a mere territorial acquisition. It became a fortified, permanent naval base. From this vantage point, British forces could easily menace China's coastal cities while simultaneously safeguarding all British commercial interests. Critically, possession of Hong Kong ensured that Britain could resume opium trafficking under the unassailable protection of the Royal Navy, rendering any future attempt at Chinese resistance a military impossibility. Even more devastating were the provisions establishing the treaty ports, 5 specific Chinese cities where British subjects would enjoy extraterritorial rights. This meant that British residents were subject to British law rather than Chinese jurisdiction, even while operating on Chinese soil. Canton, Guangzhou, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai thus became, in effect, British commercial enclaves operating inside Chinese sovereign borders. These extraterritorial provisions instantly established a legal framework for the virtually unlimited British commercial penetration of Chinese markets. Merchants operating out of these treaty ports gained the power to disregard Chinese regulations, evade Chinese taxation, and appeal directly to British consular protection whenever Chinese authorities attempted basic law enforcement, most critically for the resumption of the opium trade. Extraterritorial rights meant that Chinese officials were powerless to prosecute British drug traffickers unless British consuls explicitly approved such legal action. Since British consuls were fundamentally tasked with safeguarding British commercial interests, the result was a foregone conclusion. Opium sales would recommence and operate under the official, legally sanctioned protection of the British government. The treaty also instituted the debilitating principle of most favoured nation status. This clause guaranteed that any commercial privileges China might grant to any other foreign power would automatically and immediately extend to Britain. This provision strategically neutralized China's ability to counterbalance European rivals against each other, or to restrict British access through targeted discriminatory trade policies. Chinese negotiator Qi Ying was acutely aware that he was signing away China's fundamental sovereignty over its own domestic economic policy. Yet, the alternatives were catastrophically worse. British forces had thoroughly proven their capacity to destroy coastal defenses, enforce crippling blockades on Chinese ports, and disrupt all Chinese commerce indefinitely. Prolonged resistance would have certainly resulted in total economic collapse and the probable overthrow of the Qing government. British negotiator Pottinger faced a different set of political pressures. London demanded a treaty that would not only permanently secure overwhelming British commercial advantages, but also establish ironclad precedents for all future engagements with Asian powers. It was essential that the Chinese agreement vividly demonstrated that resistance to British trade demands led inevitably to devastating shattering consequences. Pottinger also had to reconcile several competing British interests. The East India Company demanded maximum legal protection for their opium operations and minimal regulation of drug trafficking. British manufacturers urgently sought access to Chinese markets for legitimate products. Simultaneously, the Royal Navy required strategic bases to project British power across Asia. The resulting treaty ingeniously resolved these competing demands by firmly establishing British commercial supremacy across virtually every economic sector. Opium trafficking was guaranteed resumption under extraterritorial protection. British manufactured goods were permitted entry into Chinese markets with minimal tariffs. British military forces were granted the right to operate from permanent bases on Chinese soil. However, the treaty's single most profound innovation was its implicit, devastating acknowledgement that military technology, not law or morality, determined commercial rights. China was compelled to accept British trade terms not because they were economically sound or morally defensible, but solely because Britain wielded superior weaponry and demonstrated an unwavering resolve to employ it. This brutal new principle, stating that technological superiority inherently justified commercial dominance, would radically reshape global economic relationships for the ensuing century. It meant that European powers could now impose their preferred trade terms upon Asian societies through calculated military threats, entirely indifferent to local sovereignty, indigenous economic interests, or widespread popular opposition. The treaty's specific provisions concerning opium were intentionally shrouded in ambiguous diplomatic language, carefully avoiding explicit drug legalization, while simultaneously guaranteeing the effortless resumption of British trafficking operations. By establishing sweeping free trade principles, the agreement prohibited Chinese authorities from discriminating against any specific British imports, thereby functionally legalizing opium sales without ever having to mention narcotics by name. Chinese officials understood the devastating implications with perfect clarity. Imperial Commissioner Qi Ying wrote a grim private letter to Emperor Daoguang. "We have consented to allow the foreign poison to flow unrestrained into our empire, all while paying the foreigners handsomely for the privilege of our own destruction. This treaty ensures that active resistance is impossible, and surrender proves profitable only for our adversaries." Emperor Daoguang was thus confronted with the most humiliating decision in the history of the Chinese Empire: accept terms that flagrantly violated the foundational principles of Chinese sovereignty, or continue a devastating war that threatened to consume Chinese civilization entirely. He chose reluctant acceptance, bitterly penning, "We submit to these demands not because they hold any claim to justice, but because all resistance has been utterly proven impossible." The treaty ratification process immediately illuminated the total shift in the balance of power. Chinese authorities were required to implement British demands instantly, whereas British compliance with Chinese concerns remained entirely voluntary and conditional. Britain had effectively seized the unilateral power to interpret the treaty terms, leaving China dependent on British goodwill for basic trade access. British merchants immediately started planning dramatically expanded operations based on the new treaty provisions. The East India Company quickly recognized that extraterritorial rights would severely mitigate operational risks, while the treaty ports provided secure, permanent bases for their extensive distribution networks. Opium sales were projected to expand exponentially under the security of British legal protection. More critically, the treaty set precedents that other European powers swiftly capitalized on. Negotiators from France, America, and Russia promptly demanded similar extraterritorial rights and commercial privileges, initiating a competitive dynamic that further corroded Chinese sovereignty. Within just 5 years of the Treaty of Nanking, China had been forced to sign comparable agreements with multiple foreign powers, with each one extracting additional commercial concessions, while contributing absolutely nothing toward Chinese economic development. China was rapidly devolving into a semi-colonial economy, systematically controlled by foreign merchants, operating under the shield of foreign legal protection. The treaty's long-term ramifications stretched far beyond China's borders. European powers quickly grasped that they had discovered an ingenious formula for controlling vast Asian economies without incurring the enormous costs and administrative burdens of direct territorial governance. Strategic military pressure could secure enduring commercial advantages that generated immense profits, while simultaneously maintaining plausible deniability regarding overt imperial ambitions. The Treaty of Nanking, therefore, was not merely the end of the First Opium War. It marked the true genesis of economic colonialism as the dominant mechanism for European expansion throughout Asia. Military technology had definitively proven itself a more potent tool than territorial conquest for controlling foreign markets and extracting sustained economic tribute. China's ancient empire had received a devastating education. Sovereignty was conditional upon military strength. Economic independence demanded technological parity, and moral authority held zero relevance when facing superior weaponry wielded by a population determined to use it for commercial gain. The opium trade resumed instantly, protected by British law and enforced by British weapons, fueling immense profits that would finance further British expansion and ensure Chinese dependency on foreign narcotics for generations. The resounding success in China gave rise to what British imperial strategists privately termed the Chinese model, a scalable template for controlling foreign markets efficiently, without the heavy expenditure associated with direct colonial administration. Within a decade, Britain was systematically deploying the proven tactics of the Opium Wars across Asia, laying the groundwork for what would evolve into the largest drug trafficking empire in recorded human history. The operational model was strikingly simple and effective: pinpoint highly profitable, often illegal, trade opportunities. Employ focused military pressure to secure commercial rights that utterly preempted local law enforcement. Publicly frame any indigenous resistance as a blatant violation of crucial free trade principles. Utilize superior military technology to enforce total compliance. Finally, extract maximum profits while rigorously maintaining plausible deniability regarding the inherent criminality of the endeavor. India quickly morphed into the dedicated production hub for Britain's burgeoning narcotics empire. The East India Company systematically converted vast agricultural regions into opium cultivation zones, substituting essential food crops with poppies, and thus engineering a deep economic dependency on drug exports. By 1850, British-controlled territories were churning out an estimated 50,000 chests of opium every year, a volume equivalent to $7 million of refined narcotic. To manage the sheer scale of Indian opium output, a radical, systematic reorganization of local agriculture was necessitated. British officials offered crucial advance payments to farmers who agreed to dedicate their land exclusively to poppy cultivation. They supplied superior seeds, provided technical assistance, and issued guaranteed purchase agreements. Consequently, within 2 decades, million-dollar-s of Indian farmers found themselves entirely dependent on the profitability of British drug operations. British agricultural experts refined cultivation techniques, successfully developing new poppy strains that yielded higher morphine content while requiring less arduous processing. They instituted rigorous quality control systems to ensure consistent potency across diverse production regions. In essence, they engineered the world's most ruthlessly efficient narcotic manufacturing operation, optimized solely for mass export into Asian markets. The sprawling processing facilities erected across Bengal and Bihar represented industrial-scale drug manufacturing operations that were entirely unprecedented in global history. British supervised workers converted raw poppy sap into smokable opium using specialized techniques designed to maximize addiction potential while simultaneously minimizing production costs. These vast, standardized operations bore a far closer resemblance to modern pharmaceutical manufacturing than they did to traditional agricultural processing. Despite the thorough subjugation imposed by the Treaty of Nanking, China remained the essential primary market for British narcotics. Chinese officials, driven by moral and national urgency, continually attempted to restrict opium imports through local regulations, selective tax policies, and vigorous enforcement campaigns. British merchants reacted with outrage, demanding further military intervention to guarantee complete, unimpeded market access. The Second Opium War, 1856-1860, provided a perfect demonstration of how expertly Britain had perfected its economic warfare model. Using the convenient pretext of Chinese interference with British shipping, Royal Navy forces advanced and successfully captured Beijing itself, compelling Emperor Xianfeng to accept terms even more crippling than those faced by his predecessor. The Treaty of Tientsin, signed in 1858, finalized China's grim transition into a total British commercial dependency. 20 additional treaty ports were opened to British trade. The vital Yangtze River was made accessible to British shipping. Most damningly, opium imports were explicitly and formally legalized under Chinese law. China was thus compelled to abandon all legal prohibitions against the very drug that was systematically ravaging its population. Even more crucial was the treaty provision establishing direct British control over the Chinese Customs Administration. Robert Hart, a British official, was installed as the Inspector General of Chinese Maritime Customs, guaranteeing that all trade policies were structured to serve entrenched British rather than indigenous Chinese interests. China had thereby lost the fundamental ability to regulate its own international commerce and trade revenue. The overwhelming success achieved in China emboldened Britain to rapidly expand narcotics operations across Southeast Asia. Burma, Malaya, and various other British territories were quickly converted into secondary production zones, while Singapore developed into a massive distribution hub for British opium across the entire region. British officials methodically applied the hard-won lessons of the Chinese wars to quash resistance elsewhere in Asia. Whenever local rulers dared restrict British commerce, they were immediately met with the same existential threats: accept British trade terms or face military annihilation. The robust presence of the Royal Navy's Asian Fleet ensured that resistance remained futile, while compliance was swiftly and handsomely rewarded. The successful opium model began influencing British imperial strategy far outside Asia. In regions like Africa and the Middle East, Britain utilized similar coercive tactics: identify profitable trade opportunities, eliminate local resistance through targeted military pressure, and establish commercial privileges that systematically served British interests while intentionally undermining local sovereignty. However, the drug empire's most profound innovation was purely financial. Opium profits became the engine that funded British imperial expansion globally, establishing a formidable, self-reinforcing cycle. Silver, extracted from Chinese citizens for British narcotics, was seamlessly converted into British military spending, which in turn secured the conquest of new territories and additional captive markets. The meticulous accounting records of the East India Company exposed the truly extraordinary profitability of their narcotics operations. By 1857, opium sales were generating $6.7 million annually, the equivalent of $700 million in contemporary funds. Astoundingly, this singular product line produced more revenue than all other British exports to Asia combined. These profits irrevocably transformed Britain's standing as a global power. Critical naval expansion, sweeping military modernization, and the administration of vast colonial territories were all substantially subsidized by Asian drug sales. Britain's decisive emergence as the dominant global power in the mid-19th century was intrinsically linked to its success in systematic, large-scale narcotics trafficking. British banks, major shipping conglomerates, and insurance firms all reaped substantial rewards from the drug trade's profitability. Firms like Jardine Matheson, Dent and Company, and other influential British commercial houses amassed colossal fortunes through opium distribution, all while successfully maintaining an air of impeccable respectability within London society. The escalating social devastation within China continued throughout the 1,850 British estimates suggested that between $10 and $15 million Chinese people, roughly 4% of the total population, had become addicted to imported opium. Entire regions faced severe economic collapse as productive citizens became chronically unemployable due to debilitating drug dependency. Chinese officials meticulously documented the social ruin in their reports to Beijing. Families were shattered by addiction. Vital agricultural regions were rendered incapable of harvesting crops. Military units became unreliable due to widespread officer dependence, and governmental revenues plummeted as citizens diverted funds toward purchasing drugs instead of paying taxes. Nevertheless, British officials routinely dismissed Chinese concerns regarding addiction, branding them as exaggerated complaints designed merely to justify protectionist trade policies. They fallaciously argued that opium consumption was a matter of personal choice, and that restricting sales violated individual freedom and commercial rights. This argument was demonstrably and cynically dishonest. British medical experts were perfectly familiar with the science of addiction, and significantly, British law strictly prohibited opium use by British citizens themselves. More profoundly, British officials understood that widespread Chinese addiction served strategic objectives far beyond immediate financial gains. Mass drug dependency crippled Chinese military capabilities, drastically reduced overall economic productivity, and fostered political instability, making any organized resistance to British influence increasingly difficult. Lord Clarendon, the British Foreign Secretary, wrote privately in 1857, "The opium trade serves our interests in multiple ways. It generates immediate profits, substantially weakens Chinese resistance to our commercial penetration, and ensures their continued dependency on our goodwill. We have discovered how to make conquest profoundly profitable for us and systematically poisonous for them." By 1860, Britain had established a vast narco-empire stretching from India to China, generating immense profits that funded global imperial expansion, while creating addiction crises that destabilized Asian societies. This system proved that the priority of British commercial interests could ruthlessly supersede local sovereignty and human welfare. The world's first systematic economic warfare campaign had proven both its effectiveness and its staggering profitability. The East India Company's reign of ruthless economic extraction in India finally reached its brutal climax, with the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny. Dissatisfaction among Indian soldiers over low pay and mistreatment exploded into a widespread uprising. Although the British crushed the revolt with ferocity, the chaos forced a political reckoning. The rebellion irrevocably changed everything. In 1858, the British government dissolved the East India Company, stripping it of its power, and India was placed under the direct rule of the Crown, a period known as the British Raj. The Crown thus assumed direct responsibility for the exploitation and opium production previously outsourced to the company. Yet, the same financial pride that built the empire ultimately caused its economic suicide. World War I left Britain bankrupt, owing massive debt, particularly to the United States. Despite the economic devastation, the London elite, driven by pride and nostalgia, made a disastrous decision to return to the gold standard at the overvalued pre-war rate of 4.86 per pound in 1925. This choice was driven by the vanity of politicians like Winston Churchill, who famously overruled the warnings of economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes predicted that overvaluing the currency by 10% would declare war on the working class, forcing employers to slash wages to remain competitive globally. Keynes was tragically correct. The policy triggered brutal deflation, mass unemployment never dropping below $1 million, and industrial chaos. This culminated in the devastating general strike of 1926 and the iconic Jarrow Crusade of 1936, where 200 unemployed men marched 300 miles to London just to ask for the right to work, only to be refused an audience with the Prime Minister. The government and the financial system sacrificed the prosperity of its people to defend a symbol. When Britain was finally forced off the gold standard in 1931, the economic suffering of the preceding decade was revealed to be a catastrophic, self-inflicted wound. This financial exhaustion, coupled with the humiliation of the Suez Crisis in 1956, where the US and the Soviet Union forced Britain to withdraw its troops, finally exposed the empire's diminished global power, marking the true symbolic end of its global supremacy. This imperial control, however, came at a cost to the EIC itself. In 1857, deep resentment over British rule exploded into the Indian Rebellion, Sepoy Mutiny. Indian soldiers, tired of the heavy-handed British rule, sparked a rebellion that spread throughout the nation. Although the British forces brutally crushed the revolt, the chaos was so significant that it irrevocably altered governance. The British government decided to dissolve the East India Company, stripping it of its political power, and India was placed under the direct rule of the Crown, a period known as the British Raj. The Crown thus assumed direct responsibility for the exploitation and opium production previously managed by the corporate shadow empire. The British Opium Empire officially ceased operations in 1917 when the final legal opium sales concluded, but its destructive impact continues to reverberate through modern geopolitics in ways that few people fully recognize. The British Opium Empire officially ceased operations in 1917, but its methods were not retired. They were simply digitized and adapted. The core strategies Britain pioneered, the aggressive use of financial leverage and the unilateral imposition of commercial terms, did not disappear. Instead, they became the genetic code for modern economic warfare. The fundamental notion that superior military capability justifies imposing preferential commercial terms on weaker nations, entirely irrespective of their domestic law or national sovereignty, is a concept that stems directly from the justifications Britain deployed to attack China starting in 1839. Modern Chinese leadership understands this historical connection intimately. When Xi Jinping references the century of humiliation that began with the Opium Wars, he is not merely making a historical observation. He is actively identifying enduring patterns that Chinese strategists believe continue to define global interactions today. From Beijing's perspective, contemporary trade disputes often appear to be simply updated versions of 19th-century economic warfare. The 1997 handover of Hong Kong marked the symbolic conclusion of the Opium Empire's territorial legacy. Yet, the commercial principles first established through systematic drug trafficking remain deeply embedded within the framework of international trade law. Concepts such as most favored nation status, extraterritorial corporate rights, and formal trade dispute mechanisms all originated in punitive treaties violently forced upon China at gunpoint by British opium merchants. HSBC Bank represents the most direct institutional continuity bridging historical opium trafficking and modern global financial systems. Founded in 1865 as the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC was explicitly established to manage and channel British drug money derived from Asian operations. The bank's original, foundational purpose was the sophisticated laundering of vast opium profits, while providing seemingly legitimate financial services to British merchants operating in the newly opened Chinese markets. Today, HSBC maintains its status as one of the world's largest banking institutions, yet it continually faces persistent allegations regarding money laundering on behalf of drug traffickers, terrorist organizations, and authoritarian regimes. In 2012, HSBC was forced to pay $1.9 billion in fines for laundering funds for Mexican drug cartels and violating sanctions against Iran, Libya, Sudan, and Burma. The bank officially admitted to processing $881 million in drug proceeds, while intentionally ignoring blatant signs of criminal activity. The parallels between the past and present operations are utterly striking. HSBC's role in the 19th century centered on processing massive opium profits, while maintaining an operational illusion of plausible deniability regarding the source of the funds. Their 21st century violations employed identical techniques, processing illegal criminal proceeds while systematically circumventing inquiries regarding the money's origin. The bank's underlying institutional culture appears fundamentally unchanged despite 150 years of alleged regulatory advancement. Standard Chartered, another significant British bank with deep roots in Asian operations, has faced comparable money laundering allegations involving sanctions violations related to Iran and accusations of terrorist financing. Like HSBC, Standard Chartered's origins are directly linked to British imperial financial operations during the opium period. These institutions did not acquire their money laundering capabilities by accident. They were architecturally designed for precisely those purposes. Furthermore, the City of London financial district, which rose to become Europe's dominant financial centre during the opium era, continues to serve as a vital global hub for questionable financial flows today. British financial regulations are specifically structured to accommodate specialised private banking services that place paramount importance on client anonymity, over source transparency. Wealthy figures affiliated with authoritarian regimes, sophisticated criminal organizations, and corrupt governments can effortlessly access British financial services with minimal meaningful scrutiny. This systemic accommodation is not accidental. It is the direct institutional descendant of the precise financial mechanisms developed to manage colossal British opium profits during the 19th century. The very same legal structures, permissive regulatory approaches, and institutional practices that were first established to legitimize drug money 2 centuries ago continue to facilitate identical activities in the present era. Modern pharmaceutical companies operate using business models that were pioneeringly established by the East India Company's narcotics operations. These corporations maintain comprehensive control over cultivation, research and development, processing, manufacturing, distribution, and marketing, all while leveraging legal frameworks to ruthlessly eliminate competition and maintain overwhelming pricing power. The catastrophic opioid epidemic in America serves as a chilling demonstration of how effectively these same techniques function when deployed against a domestic population rather than a foreign one. Purdue Pharma, the manufacturer of OxyContin, deployed tactics strikingly reminiscent of those used by British opium merchants, minimizing reported addiction risks, relentlessly maximizing prescription volumes, lobbying vigorously against governmental regulation, and shifting blame entirely onto users rather than suppliers when addiction crises inevitably erupted. The company generated billion-dollar in profits, while simultaneously creating million-dollar-s of addicts, mirroring precisely the grim dynamic established by the East India Company in China. The Sackler family, the proprietors of Purdue Pharma, amassed a personal fortune estimated at $13 billion through aggressive OxyContin sales, despite possessing intimate knowledge that their product was fueling widespread addiction. Internal company documents later revealed that Sackler family members were personally involved in designing sophisticated marketing strategies intended to boost prescriptions among the most vulnerable populations, including the elderly and patients suffering from chronic pain conditions. Purdue Pharma's marketing methodologies directly mirrored British opium promotion strategies utilized in 19th century China. Company sales representatives were explicitly instructed to minimize addiction risks while heavily emphasizing immediate pain relief benefits. They strategically targeted physicians in economically depressed areas, where patients were less likely to question medical advice or seek second opinions. Substantial financial incentives were offered to physicians who prescribed large volumes of opioids, while avoiding markets where growing addiction problems might attract unwanted regulatory attention. The geographic distribution of America's opioid epidemic precisely mirrors the patterns of British opium addiction in China. Addiction rates are highest in Appalachian communities, post-industrial Rust Belt cities, and impoverished rural areas, characterized by limited economic opportunities and weakened social institutions. Just like 19th century China, modern American addiction disproportionately concentrates in populations that lack the requisite political power to resist systematic commercial exploitation. Johnson & Johnson, another major pharmaceutical corporation involved in opioid manufacturing, utilized comparable techniques while striving to maintain an even greater veneer of corporate respectability. The company actively promoted opioid prescriptions through deceptive front organizations that presented themselves as independent medical associations, but were, in fact, secretly funded by pharmaceutical interests. They published selective research minimizing addiction risks while aggressively suppressing studies that demonstrated contrary conclusions. These sophisticated tactics are in direct parallel with British techniques employed during the opium period. The East India Company similarly funded medical experts who publicly argued that opium was medically beneficial for Chinese health, while systematically suppressing any information regarding the dangers of addiction. They created front organizations that appeared neutral but were purely dedicated to serving the company's commercial interests. They actively promoted opium use among vulnerable populations. The CIA's historical involvement in drug trafficking during the Cold War provides perhaps the most recent and direct governmental parallel to the British opium operations. Agency operatives actively supported narcotics producers in Afghanistan, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, using drug profits to finance covert anti-communist operations, while meticulously maintaining plausible deniability regarding the trafficking activities. During the Vietnam War, CIA personnel worked directly alongside Hmong tribes in Laos, who cultivated opium poppies specifically for conversion into heroin. The agency secured military protection for drug cultivation areas, utilized its own aircraft to transport processed narcotics, and successfully established distribution networks that served both American military personnel and broader Asian markets. These multifaceted operations simultaneously generated untraceable funds for covert actions, while, tragically, fostering widespread addiction among U.S. soldiers. The subsequent Iran-Contra scandal confirmed a parallel pattern of CIA involvement in cocaine trafficking. Throughout the 1,980 seconds, agency operatives facilitated drug shipments from Nicaragua into Los Angeles, using the resultant profits to illegally finance the Contras rebels in Central America. This entire enterprise was a textbook application of the British opium model: leverage illicit drug revenue to fund geopolitical and military objectives, while maintaining an ironclad layer of governmental deniability concerning the criminal activities. In the more recent past, American military engagements in Afghanistan have coincided with an unprecedented expansion of opium cultivation. Today, Afghanistan is estimated to produce roughly 80% of the world's illegal opium, with the key cultivation zones concentrated specifically in regions under American military protection. While U.S. officials vehemently deny any direct involvement in drug trafficking, the striking correlation between military presence and the exponential growth of opium production faithfully replicates the historical patterns established during British imperial operations. The institutional parallels are strikingly similar. In 19th-century Afghanistan, British military forces provided security for opium cultivation areas that funneled narcotics into Chinese markets. In 21st century Afghanistan, American military forces operated in regions that supply global heroin markets. In both cases, the core activity involves safeguarding drug cultivation areas while simultaneously pursuing broader geopolitical imperatives. Drug Enforcement Administration (DEA) operations in Latin America further illustrate how counter-narcotics efforts can be strategically tailored to serve imperial rather than public health objectives. U.S. drug enforcement efforts consistently target organizations that oppose American political interests, often ignoring groups that support U.S. foreign policy goals. This pattern of selective enforcement suggests that the DEA's mission often serves imperial projection rather than strict criminal justice purposes. Contemporary economic sanctions represent the most direct, refined descendant of British Opium War tactics. When powerful nations deploy pervasive economic pressure to force policy changes in weaker sovereign countries, they are applying techniques perfected during Britain's systematic destruction of China's economic sovereignty. The American sanctions campaign against Iran clearly demonstrates this updated methodology. The United States no longer requires a military invasion to control Iranian domestic policy. Financial suffocation achieves the same strategic objectives far more efficiently by restricting Iranian access to crucial international banking systems. American officials can consequently devastate the Iranian economy, while maintaining the pretense that they are merely enforcing internationally recognized law. The legal justifications employed are virtually identical to those British officials used during the opium period. American sanctions are presented to the world as the righteous enforcement of international norms, rather than the coercion of sovereign governments. Iranian resistance to American economic demands is subsequently framed as flagrant violations of international obligations, rather than a legitimate exercise of national sovereignty. SWIFT, the International Banking Communication System, has effectively become the modern equivalent of the Royal Navy's control over vital Asian shipping routes. American officials can exclude any target country from global financial systems simply by pressuring SWIFT to terminate their access. This leverage grants the US the chilling ability to economically devastate any nation dependent on international trade, regardless of that nation's military strength. The sanctions imposed on Russia following the invasion of Ukraine unequivocally demonstrate the potency of economic warfare over kinetic conflict. Western financial restrictions have damaged the Russian economy more severely and structurally than direct military attacks on Russian territory. These comprehensive sanctions target Russian access to technology, financial systems, and international markets, successfully achieving strategic damage while avoiding the immense costs and risks of military confrontation. The sanctions also create self-reinforcing advantages for the imposing powers. Russian assets frozen within Western financial systems become available for potential seizure and redistribution to Western allies. Furthermore, economic disruption within Russia creates immediate opportunities for Western companies to capture and consolidate Russian market share. This zero-sum strategy simultaneously weakens the targets while strengthening the nations that impose the restrictions. Chinese officials frequently and explicitly compare American economic pressure to British Opium War tactics. When American negotiators demand Chinese policy concessions in exchange for market access, Chinese strategists perceive merely updated versions of Britain's 19th-century demands for commercial subjugation. The weapons deployed are economic rather than military, but the underlying dynamics of power projection remain identical. The decisive technological innovations that gave Britain asymmetric advantages over Chinese forces, steam propulsion, iron armor, and explosive shells were early examples of military, industrial innovation that modern defense contractors have perfected. Today, drone warfare, expansive cyber operations, and omnipresent surveillance systems provide similar asymmetric advantages over less technologically advanced opponents. American technology companies have essentially replaced the East India Company as the primary vehicles for projecting imperial power through commercial mechanisms. Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft now control global information systems while serving the strategic needs of American intelligence agencies and foreign policy objectives. These companies provide the essential technological infrastructure for modern surveillance and information warfare, while meticulously maintaining the appearance of commercial neutrality. Social media manipulation during political crises demonstrates how information warfare can destabilize foreign governments more effectively than traditional military interventions. American technology companies can either promote or suppress political movements in foreign countries simply by subtly adjusting their algorithm, HMS, and content moderation policies. These techniques provide plausible deniability while achieving strategic results that would have previously necessitated military coups. The parallels to British opium operations are striking. Both involve leveraging superior technology to undermine foreign governmental authority, while providing commercial justifications for activities that ultimately serve strategic, imperial objectives. Both strategies create deep dependency relationships that render organized resistance increasingly difficult over time. China's focused efforts to develop independent technology capabilities represent a direct attempt to avoid the technological dependency that made British economic warfare so effective during the 19th century. China's massive investments in semiconductor manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and telecommunications infrastructure are explicitly aimed at preventing a historical repetition where technological inferiority led to economic subordination. American restrictions on Chinese technology access demonstrate how modern economic warfare targets developmental capabilities rather than just military assets. By preventing Chinese companies from accessing advanced semiconductor technology, American officials can limit China's long-term economic development without resorting to military confrontation. This strategy applies the core British Opium War principles to contemporary conditions. Modern multinational corporations operate using organizational structures first pioneered by the East India Company. They combine commercial objectives with quasi-governmental functions, while demanding legal immunity from the consequences of their activities in foreign territories. This institutional framework enables the systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations while avoiding any meaningful accountability to democratic oversight. Mining companies operating in Africa demonstrate how corporate colonialism continues to extract staggering wealth from vulnerable populations using techniques perfected during the imperial period. Companies like Glencore, Rio Tinto, and Anglo American control vast mining operations that generate billion-dollar dollars in profits, yet provide minimal reciprocal benefits to local populations. Their operations routinely involve corrupting local governments, forcibly displacing traditional communities, and inflicting widespread environmental destruction that saddles the host nations with long-term social costs. These companies utilize the same fundamental legal structures that protected British opium operations: incorporation in jurisdictions with minimal oversight, complex ownership structures that obscure ultimate responsibility, and regulatory capture that ensures preferential government treatment. Modern corporate law actually provides even better protection for systematic exploitation than 19th century imperial charters ever did. Agricultural giants like Cargill and Monsanto control global food systems using techniques that directly parallel British control over opium cultivation in India. They supply seeds, fertilizers, and financing to farmers while seizing control of subsequent processing and distribution networks. This system establishes dependency relationships that make independent agricultural development increasingly difficult for developing countries. The results precisely mirror British agricultural policies in colonial India during the opium period. Traditional sustainable farming practices are abandoned in favor of export-oriented cultivation that serves foreign corporate interests rather than local dietary needs. Food security inevitably decreases, while export revenues flow predominantly to foreign corporations instead of benefiting local communities. Pharmaceutical companies continue applying these exploitative models in developing countries where regulatory oversight is minimal and legal accountability is strictly limited. Companies can use these nations as testing grounds for experimental drugs, dump dangerous or obsolete products, and manipulate pricing without facing meaningful consequences. The profits accrue to wealthy nations, while health risks are disproportionately concentrated among vulnerable populations. Modern military contractors rely on economic models pioneered during the Opium Wars. Private military companies like Blackwater operate similarly to the East India Company. They combine commercial objectives with military capabilities, profiting directly from conflicts. Crucially, they help create and maintain plausible deniability about their specific role in destabilizing foreign societies. Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, explicitly modeled his company on the East India Company's seamless combination of commercial and military functions. Blackwater operates private armies, intelligence networks, and complex logistics systems that serve both government contracts and private commercial interests. The company has been involved in military operations across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, all while maintaining corporate, rather than governmental, accountability. The business model is identical to that of the East India Company: provide military services to governments while simultaneously pursuing independent commercial objectives that may directly conflict with official policy goals. Private military contractors can engage in politically unacceptable activities that government forces could not conduct directly, thus providing essential plausible deniability for systematic exploitation. The Wagner Group, the Russian private military company, operates using similar principles across Africa and the Middle East. The company provides military services to local governments in exchange for securing mining rights, oil concessions, and other commercial advantages for Russian corporations. Like the East India Company, Wagner fuses military force with commercial extraction, while maintaining a calculated distance from official Russian foreign policy. These companies collectively demonstrate how the institutional innovations of the British Opium Empire continue to enable systematic exploitation in contemporary forms. Private armies can destabilize foreign governments, seize control of natural resources, and extract wealth, while deftly avoiding the legal constraints that limit official military operations. Modern international lending institutions utilize debt relationships to control foreign economic policies, using techniques that parallel British Opium War strategies. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank impose structural adjustment programs that mandate developing countries adopt economic policies serving wealthy nations' interests, all while claiming to provide benign development assistance. China's Belt and Road Initiative represents the most ambitious attempt to apply these techniques in reverse. Chinese officials offer massive infrastructure loans to developing countries, while securing long-term access to strategic resources and crucial transportation networks. When these countries inevitably default on Chinese loans, they transfer control over ports, mining rights, or other strategic assets directly to Chinese corporations. This model directly parallels British techniques during the Opium period. British loans to weakened Asian governments created dependency relationships that justified further economic penetration and political control. Modern debt relationships achieve similar objectives through financial architecture rather than overt military mechanisms. Sri Lanka's experience with Chinese debt demonstrates how this system operates in practice. China provided loans for port construction in Hambantota, despite knowing that Sri Lankan revenues couldn't support repayment. When Sri Lanka defaulted, China gained 99-year control over the port facility, establishing a strategic base for Chinese naval operations in the Indian Ocean. The transaction follows the British Opium Empire template perfectly. Provide financial assistance that intentionally creates dependency, then use that dependency to secure strategic concessions that serve broader imperial objectives. The weapons are economic, but the outcome is functionally identical to territorial conquest. Climate change and environmental destruction represent the ultimate application of British Opium Empire techniques to contemporary global conditions. Wealthy nations are able to devastatingly impact poorer countries through environmental policies that maximize their short-term profits while imposing catastrophic long-term costs on vulnerable populations globally. American and European fossil fuel consumption patterns impose climate costs predominantly on African, Asian, and island nations that lack the necessary technological capabilities to adapt to rapid environmental changes. The wealthy countries that benefit most from carbon emissions avoid the majority of the climate consequences, while the countries that contribute the least to the problem suffer the worst effects. This dynamic perfectly mirrors British opium policies. Actions taken by powerful nations for their own immediate economic benefit impose devastating costs on powerless populations who lack the means to resist or retaliate effectively. The geographic separation between accumulated benefits and borne costs facilitates systematic exploitation while maintaining moral detachment from the severe consequences. Corporate agriculture further demonstrates how environmental destruction can serve imperial objectives. Companies like Cargill and Tyson Foods control global food production using techniques that exhaust soil quality, pollute water systems, and destroy vital biodiversity. The environmental costs are concentrated overwhelmingly in developing countries, while the profits flow directly to wealthy nations. The results parallel British agricultural policies in India during the Opium period. Traditional sustainable farming practices are replaced with export-oriented systems that serve foreign corporate interests, simultaneously creating long-term environmental damage. that local populations are left to manage. Modern surveillance technology provides capabilities that exceed anything British imperial administrators could have imagined. Yet the objectives remain identical. Control information flows to maintain political dominance while systematically extracting economic benefits from subject populations. American technology companies collect personal data from billion-dollar of global users, sharing that information with American intelligence agencies and using it to manipulate political outcomes in foreign countries. This expansive system provides American officials with unparalleled intelligence into foreign political developments, while creating dependency relationships that make resistance increasingly difficult. Chinese social credit systems represent attempts to apply similar techniques to domestic populations, leveraging technologies that enable total surveillance and behavior modification. This system demonstrates how comprehensive information control can achieve political compliance more effectively than physical coercion. The competition between American and Chinese surveillance systems reflects a broader geopolitical struggle that parallels the historical conflicts between Britain and China during the Opium period. Both contemporary powers seek to control global information systems while actively preventing competitors from achieving technological independence. Modern cultural imperialism operates through educational institutions, media systems, and cultural products that promote values serving imperial rather than local interests. American universities, entertainment companies, and cultural organizations shape global intellectual development while advancing a narrative that legitimizes American dominance. These techniques parallel British cultural imperialism during the Opium period, when missionary schools and cultural institutions promoted Western values while actively undermining traditional knowledge systems. Modern cultural imperialism achieves similar objectives through far more sophisticated methods that maintain the appearance of intellectual freedom while promoting profound dependency relationships. The global adoption of English language education clearly demonstrates how cultural tools can serve imperial objectives. Global reliance on English grants American and British institutions permanent advantages in international communication, education, and business. Countries that adopt English-based educational systems become reliant on Western intellectual frameworks, leading to the marginalization of their traditional knowledge systems. Understanding these enduring continuities does not require belief in conspiracy theories or simplistic historical parallels. The same geographical advantages, technological capabilities, and institutional structures that facilitated British economic dominance during the Opium period continue to shape global power relationships today. Modern resistance strategies are increasingly focusing on achieving technological independence, financial diversification, and regional cooperation designed to reduce dependency on dominant powers. China's development of independent payment systems, Russia's creation of alternative international institutions, and various countries' efforts to reduce dollar reliance all represent attempts to escape the economic control mechanisms that Britain pioneered during the Opium period. The crucial difference is that modern populations understand these recurring patterns better than their 19th century predecessors. The question is not whether powerful nations will continue to employ economic warfare techniques. They obviously will. The question is whether less powerful nations can develop effective resistance strategies, or whether technological and financial advantages will prove as decisively overwhelming today as they were 2 centuries ago. Recent developments suggest that the imperial techniques pioneered during Britain's Opium Empire may be reaching a potential saturation point of effectiveness. Multiple countries are simultaneously developing alternative economic systems, forging independent technologies, and creating regional cooperation mechanisms that fundamentally reduce their vulnerability to economic warfare. However, history also suggests that imperial powers are masters of adapting their techniques to changing conditions, rather than abandoning imperial objectives outright. The next phase of global economic competition may involve new, complex forms of technological, environmental, and informational warfare that render traditional resistance strategies obsolete. The British Opium Empire established foundational principles and coercive techniques that continue to shape international relations today. Whether those patterns represent permanent features of global politics or historical anomalies that can ultimately be overcome through conscious effort remains the defining question of contemporary international relations. The stakes could not be higher. The techniques that Britain engineered for the systematic exploitation of foreign populations through commercial mechanisms have evolved into tools capable of controlling entire civilizations through environmental, technological, and financial manipulation. Understanding these pervasive patterns may be essential for human survival in an era defined by climate change, technological transformation, and ever-increasing global inequality. The certainty is not whether powerful institutions will continue deploying these techniques. They undeniably will. The critical question is whether global populations can foster the collective political consciousness and organizational capabilities necessary to resist systematic exploitation by institutions that prioritize profit over human welfare, regardless of the consequences for civilization itself. When one considers the breathtaking scope of what Britain accomplished between 1839 and 1860, it is difficult to find historical parallels for such systematic, profitable, and successful subjugation of foreign populations. The British Crown did not merely profit from drug trafficking, they perfected it as a sustainable, decisive tool of empire. The raw numbers alone tell a staggering story. Over 2 decades, British opium sales generated profits equivalent to hundreds of billions of dollars in modern currency, while simultaneously creating addiction among an estimated $15 million Chinese people, a population roughly equivalent to New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago combined. This immense population was systematically addicted to a foreign-controlled narcotic that their government had officially banned and their society desperately opposed. But the conceptual masterstroke was not the scale of the drug trafficking itself. It was the sophisticated legal and military framework that made systematic narcotics distribution appear legitimate. Britain successfully transformed criminal activity into imperial policy, rebranded drug dealers as respectable merchants, and recast military aggression as commercial law enforcement. The definitive blueprint they created used superior military technology to impose commercial terms that maximize your self-interest, while devastating local populations became the enduring model for economic warfare that continues to shape international relations today. Every time a powerful nation uses financial coercion to force policy changes in weaker countries, they are applying techniques pioneered during Britain's Opium Empire. Today, nearly 2 centuries later, China has emerged as the world's second largest economy and a primary technological competitor to the United States. Chinese leaders consistently reference the Opium Wars as formative experiences that indelibly shaped their historical consciousness and understanding of international power relationships. The century of humiliation that began with British drug trafficking was the driving motivation behind the policies that ultimately transformed China into a global superpower. A profound historical irony exists, one that Chinese officials clearly appreciate. The nation that was once systematically exploited through foreign drug trafficking now manufactures most of the world's fentanyl precursors chemicals that fuel America's own devastating opioid epidemic. Whether this represents deliberate retaliation or merely economic coincidence depends entirely on one's perspective, but the geopolitical reversal is undeniable. The pharmaceutical companies responsible for initiating America's opioid crisis utilized business models nearly identical to those pioneered by British opium merchants. Seize control of the entire supply chain, minimize addiction risks in marketing materials, while maximizing the addictive potential of the products, corrupt regulatory oversight, and deflect accountability by blaming users rather than suppliers when addiction problems emerge. Modern military contractors, powerful international banks, and intelligence agencies all operate using institutional structures and legal frameworks developed during Britain's Opium Empire. The East India Company's combination of commercial objectives and military capabilities became the enduring template for private military companies that continue to operate across conflict zones worldwide.